Good evening, and welcome to Restored Lore, your home for old, odd, and obscure stories on YouTube. So now, let's open our imaginations and begin. Once upon a time there was a wealthy merchant. He lived in a beautiful, spacious stone building in a large square directly opposite a cathedral. The front was adorned with monuments of great value. A high staircase, which led from the street to the entrance, was furnished with a magnificent iron railing of excellent workmanship, with gilded balls and ornaments. The owner of this exquisite mansion was immensely rich. He imported in his own ships from countries far away choice fruit and wine, ivory, and fragrant spices. The floor in his large hall consisted of gold coin placed on edge, and when he invited his friends to pass an evening at his home, all the dishes were served on gold plates. Every cup and plate, every knife and fork in his house was made of pure gold. There seemed to be no end to his wealth. At length the merchant died, leaving his whole property to his only son, the handsomest young man in the whole town, of excellent character, and always contented and glad. He had a smile and a pleasant word for everyone, so in his short life he had found more friends than the old merchant had ever had, in spite of his 70 years. When the young man succeeded his father as master of the magnificent house, a great many of his friends took up their abode with him. They ate at his table, drank of his wine, and stayed with him days and nights, praising his great kindness and generosity, his open hand, and his open heart. Whenever they were in need of money and mentioned it to him, he pointed to an old chest in a corner, saying, "Take what you need, and return it when you can." At length his friends made themselves so much at home that they found their way into the chest without asking permission, so in a little while the old bookkeeper, who had served the house for nearly 40 years, told his young master that all the money was gone. "Well, the chest must be filled again," said the young man carelessly. "There's the floor in the great hall. Break it up and fill the chest. We can have a marble floor laid in its place." His orders were obeyed, and there seemed to be money enough to fill the chest for all time to come. Everyone thought that the marble floor looked much handsomer than the golden one. Besides, it was not as expensive, and the friends did not know how to praise enough the wisdom and foresight of their friend. A great many poor persons who heard of his generosity came and asked to be helped from time to time, and their wishes were at once granted. The young merchant was to be married to a very beautiful young lady, the daughter of a wise counselor. When the time came for their wedding, the groom wished to give his bride a golden carriage and 6 milk-white horses, but the old bookkeeper shook his head and said that they could already see the bottom of the chest, and there were no more floors from which it could again be filled. On hearing this, the young man called his friends together and said to them that as he was in need of money, he was obliged to ask them help him. Now the time had come when he needed some of the money which they had borrowed from him at different times. None of them was willing to comply, however. Had he loaned them money, he had also told them that they might pay him whenever they could spare it. He had lived like a fool. He had been very reckless. He never cut his coat according to his cloth. To give money to the poor was the same as robbing one's friends. Their friendship was at an end, and they would be ashamed even to be seen with him on the streets hereafter. Disappointed and angry with these men for whom he had done so much, the young merchant went to the home of his betrothed, thinking she might at least give him some consolation. His friends had already been there, however, and talked to the girl's parents in such a manner that the young man was not allowed even to see her. She was locked up in a room where she sat moping and nearly crying her eyes out. It went no better with the young man at other places. All those to whom he turned for help shook their heads or abused him like a pickpocket, but no one raised a finger to help him. At length he returned home, utterly depressed and despondent, but the old bookkeeper told him to pick up courage. Some of their customers abroad owed them large sums of money. "I have saved a little from time to time," said he. "This will enable me to keep up the business until we can be helped.
Here is a list of those to whom we may expect to pay their debts. I advise you to go and see them. There is money enough here to pay your fare."
The merchant embraced the true old man and thanked him for his great faithfulness and devotion. Having received much good advice from his old friend, he set out on his journey. It seemed, however, that misfortune had determined to follow him, for all who could pay their debts refused to do so, while the rest were willing enough, but had no money. At length the young man had nothing to do but return home. One day, towards evening, he reached an inn. A storm had overtaken him, and an icy cold drizzle made him shiver from head to foot. He had been obliged to sell his horse and discharge his servant, and a few pennies were all that he had left in his purse, though home was still far away. Tired and famished, he knocked at the door, and his voice was neither cheerful nor courageous when he asked for food and shelter. The stout host with his shining face looked at the young traveller's well-worn dress and his faded hat, whereupon he said, gruffly and unkindly, "All the rooms are occupied, and all that we can give you is a place at the supper table if you can pay for it. Beggars and landlopers we have no use for here." The young merchant asked if he could not be allowed to sleep in the hay loft. It was a stormy evening, and he was tired out.
"No," replied his host. "People who have no money are not my people. I don't care what becomes of them."
"Why can't you," said one of the guests, who was sitting in a corner with several others before a steaming bowl of punch, "let this young man sleep in the old ruin across the way?"
"In the ruin?" repeated the host, grinning slyly. "Why not? That will be a splendid place to rest," continued he, turning to the young man, "if you are not afraid of ghosts."
The merchant's pride awoke. "I am afraid of no person, living or dead," said he, looking straight at the landlord's cunning features.
"Come along, then," exclaimed the man, "and I will show you the place."
He led the way out of the inn and up an avenue of old chestnut trees into a dejected ruin where time had left only a few rooms free from destruction. Into one of those they went. It was a large, gloomy room with a few pieces of furniture, an old bed with stiff faded curtains, a solid oak table, 2 easy chairs, and an old iron-clad chest. Soon a fire was made in the half-crumbled fireplace, whereupon the landlord bid the young man good night, promising to send him some supper. In a little while 2 servant girls appeared with lighted candles, which were placed on the table, and a basket from which they produced a piece of ham, bread and butter, and a chicken. Upon this the girls returned to the inn, while the young man hung up his wet mantle near the fireplace and sat down to satisfy his hunger. As soon as he had eaten, he went to bed and slept soundly. In a few hours he awoke. Everything was quiet. The fire burned slowly, and no sound was heard. Glancing toward the window to see if it was night or morning, the merchant caught sight of the tall, stout figure of a man standing in front of the table. He wore a black suit, pointed shoes, and over his shoulders was hanging a red mantle held together in front by an old-fashioned silver buckle. The young man felt his blood run cold, and his hair began to stand on end. But in the next minute he was possessed by some of his old courage, which had been strengthened by the warm room and the good supper. He sat up in bed, glancing at the stern features of his unknown visitor, until the latter approached one of the old-fashioned, high-backed easy-chairs and pointed to its seat with an imperious gesture. As the occupant of the bed made no effort to move, the ghost again pointed to the chair, while his features became threatening. The merchant, who had now entirely governed his fears, threw the pillows aside and jumped into the room, where he walked up to the chair and seated himself. The ghost immediately opened his mantle and produced a glass filled with white foam, which he placed on the table, laying a shining razor beside it. The young man in the chair now began to shiver all over his body and thought that his last moments had come. He closed his eyes and remained sitting immovable when suddenly he felt something moist and cold on his face and head. He now realized that the ghost was not intending to kill him, but only to shave his head and chin. So it was. In a little while his head was as even and shining as an ivory ball. The man laid down his razor on the table, looked imploringly at the merchant, and passed his fingers across his own head and chin. Our friend thought this quite amusing. No doubt the ghost wished to be shaved also, and a few minutes later this operation was performed. Then the ghost opened his mouth for the first time and said, "Thanks, my young friend. You have saved me, and now I can sleep peacefully." "To say the truth," replied the merchant, "I have the same desire. You awoke me at an untimely hour. But why could you not rest peacefully before?" "I lived a foolish, heedless life," replied the ghost. "I had enough of gold and silver, all that I wished for, and even more, but I squandered my wealth on those whom I called my friends, and they helped me faithfully to spend it, until one day I suddenly died. When I arrived at the gate of heaven, St. Peter told me that I was doomed to walk about at night until I found someone who would permit me to shave him and who would do me the same service." "When you are wealthy," observed the young man, "you can always count on a great number of friends. I had many until I lost my wealth." "Yes," replied the ghost. "I know them all." "You know them?" cried the merchant, startled by this intelligence. "Yes, but ask no questions. Put on your clothes and follow me." The young man complied, whereupon the ghost seized one of the candlesticks and conducted him into the cellar, where they stopped before a very old iron chest. "This," said the owner of the red mantle, "is yours. Until I was dead, I did not know that it existed, but if I had found it before, no doubt its contents would have vanished with the rest of my wealth. This chest is filled with gold coin. When you leave this dismal ruin, which was once a beautiful mansion, take it away with you, and use the money with care and caution." When they returned to the room above, the merchant said, "I do not understand why you were doomed to such work as shaving people." "Do you not understand," replied the ghost, "that I had been shaved by all my friends, and that I was now obliged to do the same? That was my penalty for living a life without aim and goal, but now I am free." The young man mused for a moment and said, "But was the money not all your own? Did you not have a right to use it as you pleased?" The ghost answered gravely, "No, it was not. I held it in trust, as every wealthy man does. The day will come when we shall account for all that we have said and done, and for the manner in which we spent the money which God entrusted to our care." Every word fell heavily upon the mind of the young man. He plunged into a deep reverie, from which he did not awake until the daylight had found its way through the green, narrow windows. Lifting his head, he noticed that the landlord stood in the open door, gazing at him with a wicked expression of joy in his small, deep-set eyes. "I see that the man with the red mantle has paid you a visit," said he, blinking maliciously at his guest. "Yes," replied the merchant, "and he proved to be an excellent man. We talked a great deal of people whom we both know, and of you, too." "Of me?"
cried the landlord. "Yes. The ghost promised to visit you in a few days and shave your head and chin. He said that he'd kept his eye on you for a great length of time." "Gracious!" shouted he. "How can I escape him? I would die of fear if I ever awoke and found him in my room."
"I shall tell him tonight," answered the young man, "that you would prefer not to be shaved as I was. But in return you must keep me here for a month, and when I am ready to return home I wish to borrow your horses and carriage." The landlord promised this, and implored him to do all that was in his power to prevent his being shaved by the terrible ghost of which he had heard so many fearful tales. In the course of the next 4 weeks the young merchant's hair had again grown into its usual length, so he left the ruin in the landlord's carriage and returned home with a chest which was found to contain an immense sum of money. The old bookkeeper initiated him into the duties of the business, which grew rapidly and brought him back his old wealth in the course of a short time. As soon as it was known that the merchant had returned home with immense riches, his friends again presented themselves at his door. The young man hired, however, a couple of stout stone-cutters, and as soon as the friends appeared they were thrown into the street more rapidly than they could realize, and never dared call a second time. But the young man hastened to the house of his sweetheart and told her parents all that had happened. The girl had remained faithful to him, and there was now no objection to their marriage. There was no golden carriage, but they were contented with less. This is the story of the merchant who learned to be faithful to his trust. Part 1. The children were always called Blue Eyes and the Turkey, and they came by the names in this manner. The elder one was like her dear father, who was far away at sea, and when the mother looked up she would often say, "Child, you have taken the pattern of your father's eyes," for the father had the bluest of blue eyes, and so gradually his little girl came to be called after them. The younger one had once, while she was still almost a baby, cried bitterly because a turkey that lived near to the cottage and sometimes wandered into the forest suddenly vanished in the middle of the winter, and to console her she had been called by its name. Now, the mother and Blue Eyes and the turkey and the baby all lived in a little lonely cottage at the edge of the forest. The forest was so near that the garden at the back seemed a part of it, and the tall fir trees were so close that their big black arms stretched over the little thatched roof, and when the moon shone upon them their tangled shadows were all over the whitewashed walls. It was a long way to the village, nearly 1.5 miles, and the mother had to work hard and had not time to go often herself to see if there was a letter at the post office from the dear father. And so, very often in the afternoon, she used to send the 2 children. They were very proud of being able to go alone, and often ran half the way to the post office. When they came back, tired with the long walk, there would be the mother waiting and watching for them, and the tea would be ready, and the baby crowing with delight. And if by any chance there was a letter from the sea, then they were happy indeed. The cottage room was so cozy, the walls were as white as snow inside as well as out, and against them hung the cake tin and the baking dish and the lid of a large saucepan that had been worn out long before the children could remember, and the fish slice all polished and shining as bright as silver. On one side of the fireplace, above the bellows, hung the almanac, and on the other the clock that always struck the wrong hour and was always running down too soon. But it was a good clock, with a little picture on its face, and sometimes ticked away for nearly a week without stopping. The baby's high chair stood in one corner, and in another there was a cupboard hung up high against the wall, in which the mother kept all manner of little surprises. The children often wondered how the things that came out of that cupboard had got into it, for they seldom saw them put there. "Dear children," the mother said one afternoon late in the autumn, "it is very chilly for you to go to the village, but you must walk quickly, and who knows but what you may bring back a letter saying that dear father is already on his way to England." Then Blue Eyes and the turkey made haste and were soon ready to go. "Don't be long," the mother said, as she always did before they started. "Go the nearest way, and don't look at any strangers you meet, and be sure you do not talk with them." "No, mother," they answered. And then she kissed them and called them dear good children, and they joyfully started on their way. The village was gayer than usual, for there had been a fair the day before, and the people who had made merry still hung about the street as if reluctant to own that their holiday was over. "I wish we had come yesterday," Blue Eyes said to the turkey. "Then we might have seen something." "Look there," said the turkey, and she pointed to a stall covered with gingerbread, but the children had no money. At the end of the street, close to the Blue Lion, where the coaches stopped, an old man sat on the ground with his back resting against the wall of a house, and by him, with smart collars round their necks, were 2 dogs. Evidently they were dancing dogs, the children thought, and longed to see them perform, but they seemed as tired as their master, and sat quite still beside him, looking as if they had not even a single wag left in their tails. "Oh, I do wish we had been here yesterday," Blue Eye said again as they went on to the grocer's, which was also the post office. The postmistress was very busy weighing out half-pounds of coffee, and when she had time to attend to the children, she only just said, "No letter for you today," and went on with what she was doing. Then Blue Eyes and the turkey turned away to go home. They went back slowly down the village street, past the man with the dogs again. One dog had roused himself and sat up rather crookedly, with his head a good deal on one side, looking very melancholy and rather ridiculous. But on the children went toward the bridge and the fields that led to the forest. They had left the village and walked some way, and then, just before they reached the bridge, they noticed, resting against a pile of stones by the wayside, a strange dark figure. At first they thought it was someone asleep, and then they thought it was a poor woman ill and hungry, and then they saw it was a strange wild-looking girl who seemed very unhappy, and they felt sure that something was the matter. So they went and looked at her, and thought they would ask her if they could do anything to help her, for they were kind children, and sorry indeed for anyone in distress. The girl seemed to be tall, and was about 15 years old. She was dressed in very ragged clothes. Round her shoulders there was an old brown shawl, which was torn at the corner that hung down the middle of her back. She wore no bonnet, and an old yellow handkerchief which she had tied around her head had fallen backwards and was all huddled up around her neck. Her hair was coal black and hung down uncombed and unfastened just anyhow. It was not very long, but it was very shiny and seemed to match her bright black eyes and dark freckled skin. On her feet were coarse gray stockings and thick shabby boots, which she had evidently forgotten to lace up. She had something hidden away under her shawl, but the children did not know what it was. At first they thought it was a baby, but when, on seeing them coming towards her, she carefully put it under her and sat upon it, they thought they must be mistaken. She sat watching the children approach, and did not move nor stir till they were within a yard of her. Then she wiped her eyes, just as if she had been crying bitterly, and looked up. The children stood still in front of her for a moment, staring at her and wondering what they ought to do. "Are you crying?" they asked shyly. To their surprise, she said in a most cheerful voice, "Oh, dear no, quite the contrary. Are you?" They thought it rather rude of her to reply in this way, for anyone could see they were not crying. They felt half in mind to walk away, but the girl looked at them so hard with her big black eyes they did not like to do so till they had said something else. "Perhaps you have lost yourself?" they said gently. But the girl answered promptly, "Certainly not. Why, you have just found me. Besides," she added, "I live in the village." The children were surprised at this, for they had never seen her before, and yet they thought they knew all the village folk by sight. "We often go to the village," they said, thinking it might interest her. "Indeed," she answered. That was all, and again they wondered what to do. Then the turkey, who had an inquiring mind, put a good, straightforward question. "What are you sitting on?" she asked. "On a pear drum," the girl answered, still speaking in a most cheerful voice, at which the children wondered, for she looked very cold and uncomfortable. "What is a pear drum?" they asked. "I'm surprised at your not knowing," the girl answered. "Most people in good society have one." And then she pulled it out and showed it to them. It was a curious instrument, a good deal like a guitar in shape. It had 3 strings, but only 2 pegs by which to tune them. The 3rd string was never tuned at all, and thus added to the singular effect produced by the village girl's music. And yet, oddly, the pear drum was not played by touching its strings, but by turning a little handle cunningly hidden on one side. But the strange thing about the pear drum was not the music it made, or the strings, or the handle, but a little square box attached to one side. The box had a little flat lid that appeared to open by a spring. That was all the children could make out at first. They were most anxious to see inside the box, or to know what it contained, but they thought it might look curious to say so. "It really is a most beautiful thing, is a pear drum," the girl said, looking at it, and speaking in a voice that was almost affectionate. "Where did you get it?" the children asked. "I bought it," the girl answered. "Didn't it cost a great deal of money?" they asked. "Yes," answered the girl slowly, nodding her head. "It cost a great deal of money. I am very rich," she added. And this the children thought a really remarkable statement, for they had not supposed that rich people dressed in old clothes or went about without bonnets. She might at least have done her hair, they thought, but they didn't like to say so. "You don't look rich," they said slowly and in as polite a voice as possible. "Perhaps not," the girl answered cheerfully. At this the children gathered courage and ventured to remark, "You look rather shabby." They did not like to say ragged. "Indeed," said the girl in the voice of one who had heard a pleasant but surprising statement. "A little shabbiness is very respectable," she added in a satisfied voice. "I must really tell them this," she continued, and the children wondered what she meant. She opened the little box by the side of the pear drum and said, just as if she were speaking to someone who could hear her, "They say I look rather shabby. It is quite lucky, isn't it?" "Why, you are not speaking to anyone," they said, more surprised than ever. "Oh dear, yes, I am speaking to them both." "Both?" they said, wondering. "Yes. I have here a little man dressed as a peasant and wearing a wide slouch hat with a large feather, and a little woman to match, dressed in a red petticoat and a white handkerchief pinned across her bosom. I put them on the lid of the box, and when I play they dance most beautifully. The little man takes off his hat and waves it in the air, and the little woman holds up her petticoat a little bit on one side with one hand, and with the other she sends forward a kiss." "Oh, let us see, let us see!" the children cried, both at once. Then the village girl looked at them doubtfully. "Let you see?" she said slowly. "Well, I'm not sure that I can. Tell me, are you good?" "Yes, yes," they answered eagerly. "We are very good." "Then it's quite impossible," she answered, and resolutely closed the lid of the box. They stared at her in astonishment. "But we are good," they cried, thinking she must have misunderstood them. "We are very good. Mother always says we are." "So you remarked before," the girl said, speaking in a tone of decision. Still the children did not understand. "Then you can't let us see the little man and woman?" they asked. "Oh dear, no," the girl answered. "I only show them to naughty children." "To naughty children?" they exclaimed. "Yes, to naughty children," she answered. "And the worse the children, the better do the man and woman dance." She put the pear drum carefully under her ragged cloak and prepared to go on her way. "I really could not have believed that you were good,"
she said reproachfully, as if they had accused themselves of some great crime. "Well, good day."
"Oh, but do show us the little man and woman," they cried.
"Certainly not. Good day," she said again.
"Oh, but we will be naughty," they said in despair.
"I'm afraid you couldn't," she answered, shaking her head. "It requires a great deal of skill, especially to be naughty well. Good day," she said for the third time. "Perhaps I shall see you in the village tomorrow." And swiftly she walked away, while the children felt their eyes fill with tears and their hearts ache with disappointment.
"If we had only been naughty," they said, "we should have seen them dance. We should have seen the little woman holding her red petticoat in her hand, and the little man waving his hat. Oh, what shall we do to make her let us see them?" "Suppose," said the turkey, "we try to be naughty today. Perhaps she would let us see them tomorrow." "But oh," said Blue Eyes, "I don't know how to be naughty. No one ever taught me." The turkey thought for a few minutes in silence. "I think I can be naughty if I try," she said. "I'll try tonight." Then poor Blue Eyes burst into tears. "Oh, don't be naughty without me," she cried. "It would be so unkind of you. You know I want to see the little man and woman just as much as you do. You are very, very unkind." And she sobbed bitterly. And so, quarreling and crying, they reached their home. Now, when their mother saw them, she was greatly astonished, and, fearing they were hurt, ran to meet them. "Oh, my children! Oh, my dear, dear children!" she said. "What is the matter?" But they did not dare tell their mother about the village girl and the little man and woman, so they answered, "Nothing is the matter. Nothing at all is the matter," and cried all the more. "But why are you crying?" she asked in surprise. "Surely we may cry if we like," they sobbed. "We are very fond of crying." "Poor children," the mother said to herself. "They are tired, and perhaps they are hungry. After tea they will be better." And she went back to the cottage and made the fire blaze until its reflection danced about on the tin lids upon the wall. And she put the kettle on to boil and set the tea things on the table and opened the window to let in the sweet fresh air and made all things look bright. Then she went to the little cupboard hung high up against the wall and took out some bread and put it on the table and said in a loving voice, "Dear little children, come and have your tea. It is all quite ready for you. And see, there is the baby waking up from her sleep. We will put her in the high chair, and she will crow at us while we eat." But the children made no answer to the dear mother. They only stood still by the window and said nothing. "Come, children," the mother said again. "Come, Blue Eyes, and come, my turkey. Here is nice sweet bread for tea." Then Blue Eyes and the turkey looked around, and when they saw the tall loaf baked crisp and brown, and the little cups all in a row, and the jug of milk all waiting for them, they went to the table and sat down and felt a little happier. And the mother did not put the baby in the high chair after all, but took it on her knee and danced it up and down, and sang little snatches of songs to it, and laughed and looked content, and thought of the father far away at sea, and wondered what he would say to them when he came home again. Then suddenly she looked up and saw that the turkey's eyes were full of tears. "Turkey!" she exclaimed. "My dear little turkey, what is the matter? Come to mother, my sweet, come to own mother." And putting the baby down on the rug, she held out her arms, and the turkey, getting up from her chair, ran swiftly into them. "Oh, mother," she sobbed. "Oh, dear mother, I do so want to be naughty." "My dear child," the mother exclaimed. "Yes, mother," the child sobbed more and more bitterly. "I do so want to be very, very naughty." And then Blue Eyes left her chair also, and, rubbing her face against the mother's shoulder, cried sadly, And so do I, Mother. Oh, I'd give anything to be very, very naughty." "But my dear children," said the mother in astonishment, "why do you want to be naughty?" "Because we do. Oh, what shall we do?" they cried together. "I should be very angry if you were naughty, but you could not be, for you love me," the mother answered. "Why couldn't we be naughty because we love you?" they asked. "Because it would make me very unhappy, and if you love me, you couldn't make me unhappy." "Why couldn't we?" they asked. Then the mother thought a while before she answered, and when she did so they hardly understood, perhaps because she seemed to be speaking rather to herself than to them. "Because if one loves well," she said gently, "one's love is stronger than all the bad feelings in one and conquers them. And this is the test whether love be real or false. Unkindness and wickedness have no power over it." "We don't know what you mean," they cried. "And we do love you, but we want to be naughty." "Then I should know you did not love me," the mother said. "And what should you do?" asked Blue Eyes. "I cannot tell. I should try to make you better." "But if you couldn't? If we were very, very, very naughty and wouldn't be good, what then?" "Then," said the mother sadly, and while she spoke her eyes filled with tears, and a sob almost choked her. "Then," she said, "I should have to go away and leave you, and to send home a new mother with glass eyes and wooden tail." "You couldn't!" they cried. "Yes, I could," she answered in a low voice, "but it would make me very unhappy, and I will never do it unless you are very, very naughty, and I am obliged." "We won't be naughty," they cried. "We will be good. We should hate a new mother, and she shall never come here." And they clung to their own mother and kissed her fondly. But when they went to bed, they sobbed bitterly, for they remembered the little man and woman and longed more than ever to see them. But how could they bear to let their own mother go away and a new one take her place? Part 2. "Good day," said the village girl when she saw Blue Eyes and the turkey approach. She was again sitting by the heap of stones, and under her shawl the pear drum was hidden. She looked just as if she had not moved since the day before. "Good day," she said, in the same cheerful voice in which she had spoken yesterday. "The weather is really charming." "Are the little man and woman there?" the children asked, taking no notice of her remark. "Yes, thank you for inquiring after them," the girl answered. "They are both here and quite well. The little man is learning how to rattle the money in his pocket, and the little woman has heard a secret. She tells it while she dances." "Oh, do let us see," they entreated. "Quite impossible, I assure you," the girl answered promptly. "You see, you are good." "Oh," said Blue Eyes sadly, "but Mother says if we are naughty she will go away and send home a new mother with glass eyes and a wooden tail." "Indeed," said the girl, still speaking in the same unconcerned voice. "That is what they all say." "What do you mean?" asked the turkey. "They all threaten that kind of thing. Of course, there really are no mothers with glass eyes and wooden tails. They would be much too expensive to make." And the common sense of this remark the children, especially the turkey, saw at once, but they merely said, half crying, "We think you might let us see the little man and woman dance." "The kind of thing you would think," remarked the village girl. "But will you if we are naughty?" they asked in despair. "I fear you could not be naughty, that is, really, even if you tried," the girl said scornfully. "Oh, but we will try, we will indeed," they cried. "Do so show them to us." "Certainly not beforehand," answered the girl, getting up and preparing to walk away. "But if we are very naughty tonight, will you let us see them tomorrow?"
Questions asked today are always best answered tomorrow, the girl said, and turned round as if to walk on. Good day, she said blithely. I really must go and play a little to myself. Good day, she repeated, and then suddenly she began to sing. Oh, sweet and fair's the ladybird, and so's the bumblebee, but I myself have long preferred the gentle chimpanzee, the gentle chimpanzee, the gentle I beg your pardon, she said, stopping and looking over her shoulder. It's very rude to sing without leave before company. I won't do it again. Oh, do go on, the children said. I'm going, she said, and walked away. No, we meant go on singing, they explained. And do just let us hear you play, they entreated, remembering that as yet they had not yet heard a single sound from the pear drum. Quite impossible, she called out as she went along. You are good, as I remarked before. The pleasures of goodness centers in itself. The pleasures of naughtiness are many and varied. Good day, she shouted, for she was almost out of hearing. For a few minutes the children stood looking after her. Then they broke down and cried. She might have let us see them, they sobbed. The turkey was the first to wipe away her tears. Let us go home and be very naughty, she said. Then perhaps she will let us see them tomorrow. But what shall we do? Asked Blue Eyes, looking up. Then together all the way home they planned how to begin being naughty. And that afternoon the dear mother was sorely distressed, for, instead of sitting at their tea as usual with smiling happy faces, and then helping her to clear away and doing all she told them, they broke their mugs and threw their bread and butter on the floor, and when the mother told them to do one thing, they carefully went and did another, and as for helping her to put away, they left her to do it all by herself, and only stamped their feet with rage when she told them to go upstairs until they were good. We won't be good, they cried. We hate being good, and we always mean to be naughty. We like being naughty very much. Do you remember what I told you I should do if you were very, very naughty? She asked sadly. Yes, we know, but it isn't true, they cried. There is no mother with a wooden tail and glass eyes, and if there was, we should just stick pins into her and send her away. But there is none. Then the mother became really angry at last and sent them off to bed, but instead of crying and being sorry at her anger, they laughed for joy, and when they were in bed they sat up and sang merry songs at the top of their voices. The next morning, quite early, without asking leave from the mother, the children got up and ran off as fast as they could over the fields towards the bridge to look for the village girl. She was sitting as usual by the heap of stones with the pear drum under her shawl. Now please show us the little man and woman, they cried, and let us hear the pear drum. We were very naughty last night. But the girl kept the pear drum carefully hidden. We were very naughty, the children cried again. Indeed, she said, in precisely the same tone in which she had spoken yesterday. But we were, they repeated. We were indeed. So you say, she answered. You were not half naughty enough. Why, we were sent to bed. Just so, said the girl, putting the other corner of the shawl over the pear drum. If you had been really naughty, you wouldn't have gone. But you can't help it, you see. As I remarked before, it requires a great deal of skill to be naughty well. But we broke our mugs. We threw our bread and butter on the floor. We did everything we could to be tiresome. Mere trifles, answered the village girl scornfully. Did you throw cold water on the fire? Did you break the clock? Did you pull all the tins down from the walls and throw them on the floor? No, exclaimed the children, aghast. We did not do that. I thought not, the girl answered. So many people mistake a little noise and foolishness for real naughtiness, but, as I remarked before, it wants skill to do the thing properly. Well, good day. And before they could say another word, she had vanished. We'll be much worse, the children cried in despair. We'll go and do all the things she says.
And then they went home and did all those things. They threw water on the fire. They pulled down the baking dish and the cake tin, the fish slice and the lid of the saucepan they had never seen, and banged them on the floor. They broke the clock and danced on the butter. They turned everything upside down, and then they sat still and wondered if they were naughty enough. And when Mother saw all that they had done, she did not scold them as she had the day before or send them to bed, but she just broke down and cried and looked at the children and said sadly, "Unless you are good tomorrow, my poor blue eyes in turkey, I shall indeed have to go away and come back no more, and the new mother I told you of will come to you." They did not believe her, yet their hearts ached when they saw how unhappy she looked, and they thought within themselves that when they once had seen the little man and woman dance, they would be good to the dear mother forever afterwards. But they could not be good now till they had heard the sound of the pear drum, seen the little man and woman dance, and heard the secret told. Then they would be satisfied. The next morning, before the birds were stirring, before the sun had climbed high enough to look in at their bedroom window, or the flowers had wiped their eyes ready for the day, the children got up and crept out of the cottage and ran across the fields. They did not think the village girl would be up so very early, but their hearts had ached so much at the sight of the mother's sad face that they had not been able to sleep, and they longed to know if they had been naughty enough, and if they might just once hear the pear drum and see the little man and woman, and then go home and be good forever. To their surprise, they found the village girl sitting by the heap of stones, just as if it were her natural home. They ran fast when they saw her, and they noticed that the box containing the little man and woman was open, but she closed it quickly when she saw them, and they heard the clicking of the spring that kept it fast. "We have been very naughty," they cried. "We have done all the things you told us. Now, will you show us the little man and woman?" The girl looked at them curiously, then drew the yellow silk handkerchief she sometimes wore round her head out of her pocket and began to smooth out the creases in it with her hands. "You really seem quite excited," she said in her usual voice. "You should be calm. Calmness gathers in and hides things like a big cloak, or like my shawl does here, for instance," and she looked down at the ragged covering that hid the pear drum. "We have done all the things you told us," the children cried again, "and we do so long to hear the secret." But the girl only went on smoothing out her handkerchief. "I am so very particular about my dress," she said. They could hardly listen to her in their excitement. "But do tell if we may see the little man and woman," they entreated again. "We have been so very naughty, and Mother says she will go away today and send home a new mother if we are not good." "Indeed," said the girl, beginning to be interested and amused. "The things that people say are most singular and amusing. There is an endless variety in language." But the children did not understand, only entreated once more to see the little man and woman. "Well, let me see," the girl said at last, just as if she were relenting. "When did your mother say she would go?" "But if she goes, what shall we do?" they cried in despair. "We don't want her to go. We love her very much. Ah, what shall we do if she goes?" "People go and people come. First they go and then they come. Perhaps she will go before she comes. She couldn't come before she goes. You had better go back and be good," the girl answered suddenly. "You are really not clever enough to be anything else, and the little woman's secret is very important. She never tells it for make-believe naughtiness." "But we did do all the things you told us," the children cried despairingly. "You didn't throw the looking-glass out of window or stand the baby on its head." "No, we didn't do that," the children gasped. "I thought not," the girl said triumphantly. "Well, good day. I shall not be here tomorrow. Good day." "Oh, but don't go away," they cried. "We are so unhappy. Do let us see them just once." "Well, I shall go past your cottage at 11 o'clock this morning," the girl said. "Perhaps I shall play the pear drum as I go by." "And will you show us the man and woman?" they asked.
Quite impossible unless you have really deserved it. Make-believe naughtiness is only spoilt goodness. Now, if you break the looking-glass and do the things that are desired."
"Oh, we will," they cried. "We will be very naughty till we hear you coming."
"It's a waste of time, I fear," the girl said politely. "But of course I should not like to interfere with you. You see, the little man and woman, being used to the best society, are very particular." "Good day," she said, just as she always said, and then quickly turned away. But she looked back and called out, 11 o'clock. I shall be quite punctual. I am very particular about my engagements." Then again the children went home and were naughty, oh so very, very naughty that the dear mother's heart ached and her eyes filled with tears, and at last she went upstairs and slowly put on her best gown and her new sunbonnet, and she dressed the baby in all its Sunday clothes, and then she came down and stood before Blue Eyes and the turkey. And just as she did so, the turkey threw the looking-glass out of window, and it fell with a loud crash upon the ground. "Goodbye, my children," the mother said, sadly kissing them. "Goodbye, my Blue Eyes. Goodbye, my turkey. The new mother will be home presently. Oh, my poor children." And then, weeping bitterly, the mother took the baby in her arms and turned to leave the house. "But, mother," the children cried, "we are—" And then suddenly the broken clock struck 10:30, and they knew that in half an hour the village girl would come playing on the pear drum. "But, mother, we will be good at 11:30. Come back at 11:30, they cried. "And we'll both be good. We will indeed. We must be naughty till 11 o'clock. But the mother only picked up the little bundle in which she had tied up her cotton apron and a pair of old shoes, and went slowly out at the door. It seemed as if the children were spellbound and they could not follow her. They opened the window wide and called after her, "Mother, mother, oh dear mother, come back again. We will be good. We will be good now. We will be good for evermore if you will come back." But the mother only looked round and shook her head, and they could see the tears falling down her cheeks. "Come back, dear mother," cried Blue Eyes, but still the mother went on across the fields. Come back, cried the turkey, but still the mother went on. Just by the corner of the field she stopped and turned and waved her handkerchief, all wet with tears, to the children at the window. She made the baby kiss its hand, and in a moment mother and baby had vanished from their sight. Then the children felt their hearts ache with sorrow, and they cried bitterly just as the mother had done, and yet they could not believe that she had gone. Surely she would come back, they thought. She would not leave them altogether. But oh, if she did, if she did, if she did! And then the broken clock struck 11, and suddenly there was a sound, a quick, clanging, jangling sound, with a strange, discordant one at intervals, and they looked at each other while their hearts stood still, for they knew it was the pear drum. They rushed to the open window, and there they saw the village girl coming toward them from the fields, dancing along and playing as she did so. Behind her, walking slowly and yet ever keeping the same distance from her, was the man with the dogs whom they had seen asleep by the Blue Lion on the day they first saw the girl with the pear drum. He was playing on a flute that had a strange shrill sound. They could hear it plainly above the jangling of the pear drum. After the man followed the two dogs, slowly waltzing round and round on their hind legs. "We have done all you told us," the children called when they had recovered from their astonishment. "Come and see, and now show us the little man and woman." The girl did not cease her playing or her dancing, but she called out in a voice that was half speaking, half singing, and seemed to keep time to the strange music of the pear drum. "You did it all badly. You threw the water on the wrong side of the fire. The tin things were not quite in the middle of the room. The clock was not broken enough. You did not stand the baby on its head."
Then the children, still standing spellbound by the window, cried out, entreating and wringing their hands, "Oh, but we have done everything you told us, and Mother has gone away. Show us the little man and woman now, and let us hear the secret." As they said this, the girl was just in front of the cottage, but she did not stop playing. The sound of the strings seemed to go through their hearts. She did not stop dancing. She was already passing the cottage by. She did not stop singing, and all she said sounded like part of a terrible song. And still the man followed her, always at the same distance, playing shrilly on his flute. And still the two dogs waltzed round and round after him, their tails motionless, their legs straight, their collars clear and white and stiff. On they went, all of them together. "Oh, stop," the children cried, "and show us the little man and woman now." But the girl sang out loud and clear, while the string that was out of tune twanged above her voice. "The little man and woman are far away. See, their box is empty." And then for the first time the children saw that the lid of the box was raised and hanging back, and that no little man and woman were in it. "I am going to my own land," the girl sang, "to the land where I was born." And she went on toward the long straight road that led to the city many miles away. But our mother is gone," the children cried. "Our dear mother, will she ever come back?" "No," sang the girl. "She'll never come back, she'll never come back. I saw her by the bridge. She took a boat upon the river. She is sailing to the sea. She will meet your father once again, and they will go sailing on to the countries far away." And when they heard this, the children cried out, but could say no more, for their hearts seemed to be breaking. Then the girl, her voice getting fainter and fainter in the distance, called out once more to them. And but for the dread that sharpened their ears, they would hardly have heard her, so far away was she, and so discordant was the music. "Your new mother is coming. She is already on her way, but she only walks slowly, for her tail is rather long, and her spectacles are left behind. But she is coming, she is coming, coming, coming." The last word died away. It was the last one they ever heard the village girl utter. On she went, dancing on, and on followed the man. They could see that he was still playing, but they could no longer hear the sound of his flute, and on went the dogs, round and round and round. On they all went, further and further away, till they were separate things no more, till they were just a confused mass of faded color, till they were a dark, misty object that nothing could define, till they had vanished altogether, and forever. Then the children turned and looked at each other and at the little cottage home that only a week before had been so bright and happy, so cozy and so spotless. The fire was out, and the water was still among the cinders. The baking dish and cake tin, the fish slice and the saucepan lid, which the dear mother used to spend so much time in rubbing, were all pulled down from the nails on which they had hung so long, and were lying on the floor. And there was the clock all broken and spoilt. The little picture upon its face could be seen no more, and though it sometimes struck a stray hour, it was with the tone of a clock whose hours are numbered. And there was the baby's high chair, but no little baby to sit in it. There was the cupboard on the wall, and never a sweet loaf on its shelf. And there were the broken mugs, and the bits of bread tossed about, and the greasy boards which the mother had knelt down to scrub until they were white as snow. In the midst of all stood the children, looking at the wreck they had made, their hearts aching, their eyes blinded with tears, and their poor little hands clasped together in their misery. "Oh, what shall we do?" cried Blue Eyes. "I wish we had never seen the village girl and the nasty, nasty pear drum." "Surely Mother will come back," sobbed the turkey. "I'm sure we shall die if she doesn't come back." "I don't know what we shall do if the new mother comes," cried Blue Eyes. "I shall never, never like any other mother. I don't know what we shall do if that dreadful mother comes." "We won't let her in," said the turkey. "But perhaps she'll walk in," sobbed Blue Eyes. Then Turkey stopped crying for a minute to think what should be done. "We will bolt the door," she said, "and shut the window, and we won't take any notice when she knocks." So they bolted the door and shut the window and fastened it. And then, in spite of all they had said, they felt naughty again and longed after the little man and woman they had never seen, far more than after the mother who had loved them all their lives. But then they did not really believe that their own mother would not come back, or that any new mother would take her place. When it was dinner time, they were very hungry, but they could only find some stale bread, and they had to be content with it. "Oh, I wish we heard the little woman's secret," cried the turkey. "I wouldn't have cared then." All through the afternoon they sat watching and listening for fear of the new mother, but they saw and heard nothing of her, and gradually they became less and less afraid lest she should come. Then they thought that perhaps when it was dark their own dear mother would come home, and perhaps if they asked her to forgive them she would. And then Blue Eyes thought that if their mother did come, she would be very cold. So they crept out at the back door and gathered in some wood, and at last, for the grate was wet and it was a great deal of trouble to manage it, they made a fire. When they saw the bright fire burning and the little flames leaping and playing among the wood and coal, they began to be happy again and to feel certain that their own mother would return, and the sight of the pleasant fire reminded them of all the time she had waited for them to come from the post office, and of how she had welcomed them and comforted them and given them nice warm tea and sweet bread and talked to them. Oh, how sorry they were they had been naughty, and for that nasty village girl. They did not care a bit about the little man and woman now, nor want to hear the secret. They fetched a pail of water and washed the floor. They found some rag and rubbed the tins till they looked bright again, and, putting a footstool on a chair, they got up on it very carefully and hung up the things in their places. Then they picked up the broken mugs and made the room as neat as they could, till it looked more and more as if the dear mother's hands had been busy about it. They felt more and more certain she would return, she and the dear little baby together, and they thought they would set the tea things for her, just as she had so often set them for her naughty children. They took down the tea tray and got out the cups and put the kettle on the fire to boil and made everything look as homelike as they could. There was no sweet loaf to put on the table, but perhaps the mother would bring something from the village, they thought. At last all was ready, and Blue Eyes and the turkey washed their faces and their hands, and then sat and waited, for of course they did not believe what the village girl had said about their mother sailing away. Suddenly, while they were sitting by the fire, they heard a sound as if something heavy was being dragged along the ground outside. And then there was a loud and terrible knocking at the door. The children felt their hearts stand still. They knew it could not be their own mother, for she would have turned the handle and tried to come in without any knocking at all. "Oh, Turkey," whispered Blue Eyes, "if it should be the new mother, what shall we do?" "We won't let her in," whispered the turkey, for she was afraid to speak aloud, and again there came the long and loud and terrible knocking at the door. "What shall we do? Oh, what shall we do?" cried the children in despair. "Go away," they called out. "Oh, go away. We won't let you in. We will never be naughty any more. Go away, go away." But again there came a loud and terrible knocking. "She'll break the door if she knocks so hard," cried Blue Eyes. "Go and put your back to it," whispered the turkey, "and I'll peep out of the window to see if it's really the new mother." So, in fear and trembling, Blue Eyes put her back against the door, and the turkey went to the window and, pressing her face against one side of the frame, peeped out. She could just see a black satin poke bonnet with a frill round the edge and a long, bony arm carrying a black leather bag. From beneath the bonnet there flashed a strange, bright light, and Turkey's heart sank and her cheeks turned pale, for she knew it was the flashing of two glass eyes. She crept up to Blue Eyes. "It is, it is, it is," she whispered, her voice shaking with fear. "It is the new mother. She has come and brought her luggage in a black leather bag that is hanging on her arm." "Oh, what shall we do?" wept Blue Eyes, and again there was the terrible knocking. "Come and put your back against the door too, Turkey," cried Blue Eyes. "I'm afraid it will break." So together they stood with their two little backs against the door. There was a long pause. They thought perhaps the new mother had made up her mind that there was no one at home to let her in and would go away. But presently the two children heard through the thin wooden door the new mother move a little and then say to herself, "I must break open the door with my tail." For one terrible moment all was still, but in it the children could almost hear her lift up her tail, and then, with a fearful blow, the little painted door was cracked and splintered. With a shriek the children darted from the spot and fled through the cottage and out at the back door into the forest beyond. All night long they stayed in the darkness and the cold, and all the next day and the next, and all through the cold, dreary days and the long, dark nights that followed. They are there still, my children. All through the long weeks and months have they been there, with only the green rushes for their pillows and only the brown dead leaves to cover them, feeding on the wild strawberries in the summer, or on the nuts when they hang green, on the blackberries when they are no longer sour in the autumn, and in the winter on the little red berries that ripen in the snow. They wander about among the tall, dark fir trees or beneath the great trees beyond. Sometimes they stay to rest beside the little pool near the copse where the ferns grow the thickest, and they long and long with a longing that is greater than words can say to see their own dear mother again, just once again, to tell her they'll be good forevermore, just once again. And still the new mother stays in the little cottage, but the windows are closed and the doors are shut, and no one knows what the inside looks like. Now and then, when the darkness has fallen and the night is still, hand in hand, Blue Eyes and the turkey creep up near to the home in which they once were so happy, and with beating hearts they watch and listen. Sometimes a blinding flash comes through the window, and they know it is the light from the new mother's glass eyes. Or they hear a strange muffled noise, and they know it is the sound of her wooden tail as she drags it along the floor. My father was not born or originally a resident in the Hartz mountains. He was the serf of a Hungarian nobleman of great possessions in Transylvania. But although a serf, he was not by any means a poor or illiterate man. In fact, he was rich, and his intelligence and respectability were such that he had been raised by his lord to the stewardship. But whoever may happen to be born a serf must he remain, even though he become a wealthy man. Such was the condition of my father. My father had been married for about 5 years, and, by his marriage, had 3 children, my eldest brother Caesar, myself, Herman, and a sister named Marcella. Latin is still the language spoken in that country, and that will account for our high-sounding names. My mother was a very beautiful woman, unfortunately more beautiful than virtuous. She was seen and admired by the lord of the soil. My father was sent away upon some mission, and, during his absence, my mother, flattered by the attentions and won by the assiduities of this nobleman, yielded to his wishes. It so happened that my father returned very unexpectedly and discovered the intrigue. The evidence of my mother's shame was positive. He surprised her in the company of her seducer. Carried away by the impetuosity of his feelings, he watched the opportunity of a meeting taking place between them, and murdered both his wife and her seducer. Conscious that, as a serf, not even the provocation which he had received would be allowed as a justification of his conduct, he hastily collected together what money he could lay his hands upon, and, as we were then in the depth of winter, he put his horses to the sleigh, and taking his children with him, he set off in the middle of the night, and was far away before the tragical circumstance had transpired. Aware that he would be pursued, and that he had no chance of escape if he remained in any portion of his native country in which the authorities could lay hold of him, he continued his flight without intermission until he had buried himself in the intricacies and seclusion of the Hartz mountains. Of course, all that I have now told you I learned afterwards. My oldest recollections are knit to a rude yet comfortable cottage in which I lived with my father, brother, and sister. It was on the confines of one of those vast forests which cover the northern part of Germany, and around it were a few acres of ground, which, during the summer months, my father cultivated, and which, though they yielded a doubtful harvest, were sufficient for our support. In the winter we remained much indoors, for, as my father followed the chase, we were left alone, and the wolves, during that season, incessantly prowled about. My father had purchased the cottage and land about it of one of the rude foresters who gained their livelihood partly by hunting and partly by burning charcoal for the purpose of smelting the ore from the neighboring mines. It was distant about 2 miles from any other habitation. I can call to mind the whole landscape now, the tall pines which rose up in the mountain above us, and the wide expanse of forest beneath, on the topmost boughs and heads of whose trees we looked down from our cottage, as the mountain below us rapidly descended into the distant valley. In summertime the prospect was beautiful, but during the severe winter a more desolate scene could not well be imagined. I said that, in the winter, my father occupied himself with the chase. Every day he left us, and often would he lock the door that we might not leave the cottage. He had no one to assist him or to take care of us. Indeed, it was not easy to find a female servant who would live in such a solitude, but could he have found one, my father would not have received her, for he had imbibed a horror of the sex, as difference of his conduct toward us, his 2 boys, and to my poor little sister, Marcella, evidently proved. You may suppose we were sadly neglected. Indeed, we suffered much, for my father, fearful that we might come to some harm, would not allow us fuel when he left the cottage, and we were obliged, therefore, to creep under the heaps of bearskins, and there to keep ourselves as warm as we could until he returned in the evening, when a blazing fire was our delight. That my father chose this restless sort of life may appear strange, but the fact was that he could not remain quiet, whether from remorse for having committed murder, or from the misery consequent on his change of situation, or from both combined. He was never happy unless he was in a state of activity. Children, however, when left much to themselves, acquire a thoughtfulness not common to their age. So it was with us, and during the short, cold days of winter we would sit silent, longing for the happy hours when the snow would melt, and the leaves burst out, and the birds begin their songs, and when we should again be set at liberty. Such was our peculiar and savage sort of life until my brother Caesar was 9, myself 7, and my sister 5 years old, when the circumstances occurred on which is based the extraordinary narrative which I am about to relate. One evening my father returned home rather later than usual. He had been unsuccessful, and, as the weather was very severe and many feet of snow were upon the ground, he was not only very cold, but in a very bad humor. He had brought in wood, and we were all 3 of us gladly assisting each other in blowing on the embers to create the blaze, when he caught poor little Marcella by the arm and threw her aside. My brother ran to raise her up. Accustomed to ill usage and afraid of my father, she did not dare to cry, but looked up in his face very piteously. My father drew his stool nearer the hearth, muttered something in abuse of women, and busied himself with the fire, which both my brother and I had deserted when our sister was so unkindly treated. A cheerful blaze was soon the result of his exertions, but we did not, as usual, crowd around it. Marcella retired to a corner, and my brother and I took our seats beside her, while my father hung over the fire gloomily and alone. Such had been our position for about half an hour, when the howl of a wolf, close under the window of the cottage, fell on our ears. My father started up and seized his gun. The howl was repeated. He examined the priming, and then hastily left the cottage, shutting the door after him. We all waited, anxiously listening, for we thought that if he succeeded in shooting the wolf, he would return in a better humor. And although he was harsh to all of us, and particularly so to our little sister, still we loved our father, and loved to see him cheerful and happy, for what else had we to look up to? And I may here observe that perhaps there never were 3 children who were fonder of each other. We did not, like other children, fight and dispute together, and if by chance any disagreement did arise between my elder brother and me, little Marcella would run to us and, kissing us both, seal, through her entreaties, the peace between us. Marcella was a lovely, amiable child. I can recall her beautiful features even now. Alas, poor little Marcella. We waited for some time, but the report of the gun did not reach us, and my elder brother then said, "Our father has followed the wolf and will not be back for some time. Marcella, let us wash your face, and then we will leave this corner and go to the fire and warm ourselves." We did so, and remained there until near midnight, every minute wondering, as it grew later, why our father did not return. We had no idea that he was in any danger, but we thought he must have chased the wolf for a very long time. "I will look out and see if father is coming," said my brother Caesar, going to the door. "Take care," said Marcella. "The wolves must be about now, and we cannot kill them, brother." My brother opened the door very cautiously, and but a few inches. He peeped out. "I see nothing," said he after a time, and once more he joined us at the fire. "We have had no supper," said I, for my father usually cooked the meat as soon as he came home, and during his absence we had nothing but the fragments of the preceding day. "And if our father comes home after his hunt, Caesar," said Marcella, "he will be pleased to have some supper. Let us cook it for him and for ourselves." Caesar climbed upon the stool and reached down some meat. I forget now whether it was venison or bear's meat, but we cut off the usual quantity and proceeded to dress it as we used to do under our father's superintendence. We were all busied putting it into the platters before the fire to await his coming when we heard the sound of a horn. We listened. There was a noise outside, and a minute afterwards my father entered, ushering in a young female and a large, dark man in a hunter's dress. Perhaps I had better now relate what was only known to me many years afterwards. When my father had left the cottage, he perceived a large white wolf about 30 yards from him. As soon as the animal saw my father, it retreated slowly, growling and snarling. My father followed. The animal did not run, but always kept at some distance, and my father did not like to fire until he was pretty certain that his ball would take effect. Thus they went on for some time, the wolf now leaving my father far behind, and then stopping and snarling defiance at him, and then again, on his approach, setting off at speed. Anxious to shoot the animal, for the white wolf is very rare, my father continued in the pursuit for several hours, during which he continually ascended the mountain. You must know that there are peculiar spots on those mountains which are supposed, and, as my story will prove, truly supposed, to be inhabited by the evil influences. They are well known to the huntsmen, who invariably avoid them. Now, one of those spots, an open space in the pine forests above us, had been pointed out to my father as dangerous on that account. But whether he disbelieved these wild stories, or whether, in his eager pursuit of the chase, he disregarded them, I know not. Certain, however, it is that he was decoyed by the white wolf to this open space when the animal appeared to slacken her speed. My father approached, came close up to her, raised his gun to his shoulder, and was about to fire when the wolf suddenly disappeared. He thought that the snow on the ground must have dazzled his sight, and he let down his gun to look for the beast, but she was gone. How she could have escaped over the clearance without his seeing her was beyond his comprehension. Mortified at the ill success of his chase, he was about to retrace his steps when he heard the distant sound of a horn. Astonishment at such a sound, at such an hour, in such a wilderness, made him forget for the moment his disappointment, and he remained riveted to the spot. In a minute the horn was blown a second time, and at no great distance. My father stood still and listened. A third time it was blown. I forget the term used to express it, but it was the signal which, my father well knew, implied that the party was lost in the woods. In a few minutes more, my father beheld a man on horseback, with a female seated on the crupper, enter the cleared space and ride up to him. At first my father called to mind the strange stories which he had heard of the supernatural beings who were said to frequent these mountains, but the nearer approach of the party satisfied him that they were mortals like himself. As soon as they came up to him, the man who guided the horse accosted him.
"Friend Hunter, you are out late, the better fortune for us. We have ridden far and are in fear of our lives, which are eagerly sought after. These mountains have enabled us to elude our pursuers, but if we find not shelter and refreshment, that will avail us little, as we must perish from hunger and the inclemency of the night. My daughter, who rides behind me, is now more dead than alive. Say, can you assist us in our difficulty?"
"My cottage is some few miles distant," replied my father. "But I have little to offer you besides a shelter from the weather. To the little I have you are welcome. May I ask whence you come?"
"Yes, friend, it is no secret now. We have escaped from Transylvania, where my daughter's honor and my life were equally in jeopardy."
This information was quite enough to raise an interest in my father's heart. He remembered his own escape. He remembered the loss of his wife's honor and the tragedy by which it wound up. He immediately and warmly offered all the assistance which he could afford them.
"There is no time to be lost then, good sir," observed the horseman. "My daughter is chilled with the frost and cannot hold out much longer against the severity of the weather."
"Follow me," replied my father, leading the way towards his home. "I was lured away in pursuit of a large white wolf," observed my father. "It came to the very window of my hut, or I should not have been out at this time of night." "The creature passed by us just as we came out of the wood," said the female in a silvery tone.
"I was nearly discharging my piece at it," observed the hunter. "But since it did us such good service, I am glad I allowed it to escape."
In about an hour and a half, during which my father walked at a rapid pace, the party arrived at the cottage, and, as I said before, came in.
"We are in good time, apparently," observed the dark hunter, catching the smell of the roasted meat, as he walked into the fire and surveyed my brother, my sister, and myself. "You have young cooks here, mynheer."
"I'm glad we shall not have to wait," replied my father. "Come, mistress, seat yourself by the fire. You require warmth after your cold ride."
"And where can I put up my horse, mynheer?" observed the huntsman.
"I will take care of him," replied my father, going out of the cottage door. The female must, however, be particularly described. She was young and apparently 20 years of age. She was dressed in a traveling dress, deeply bordered with white fur, and wore a cap of white ermine on her head. Her features were very beautiful, at least I thought so, and so my father has since declared. Her hair was flaxen, glossy, and shining, and bright as a mirror, and her mouth, although somewhat large when it was open, showed the most brilliant teeth I have ever beheld. But there was something about her eyes, bright as they were, which made us children afraid. They were so restless, so furtive. I could not at that time tell why, but I felt as if there was cruelty in her eye, and when she beckoned us to come to her, we approached her with fear and trembling. Still, she was beautiful, very beautiful. She spoke kindly to my brother and myself, petted our heads, and caressed us, but Marcella would not come near her. On the contrary, she slunk away and hid herself in the bed and would not wait for the supper, which half an hour before she had been so anxious for. My father, having put the horse into a close shed, soon returned, and supper was placed upon the table. When it was over, my father requested that the young lady would take possession of his bed, and he would remain at the fire and sit up with her father. After some hesitation on her part, this arrangement was agreed to, and I and my brother crept into the other bed with Marcella, for we had as yet always slept together. But we could not sleep. There was something so unusual, not only in seeing strange people, but in having these people sleep at the cottage, that we were bewildered. As for poor little Marcella, she was quiet, but I perceived that she trembled during the whole night, and sometimes I thought she was checking a sob. My father had brought out some spirits, which he rarely used, and he and the strange hunter remained drinking and talking before the fire. Our ears were ready to catch the slightest whisper, so much was our curiosity excited. "You said you came from Transylvania?" observed my father.
"Even so, mynheer," replied the hunter. "I was a serf to the noble house of Blank. My master would insist upon my surrendering up my fair girl to his wishes. It ended in my giving him a few inches of my hunting knife." "We are countrymen and brothers in misfortune," replied my father, taking the huntsman's hand and pressing it warmly. "Indeed? Are you, then, from that country?"
"Yes, and I too have fled for my life, but mine is a melancholy tale."
"Your name?" inquired the hunter.
"Krantz."
"What? Krantz of Blank? I have heard your tale, and you need not renew your grief by repeating it now. Welcome, most welcome, mynheer, and, I may say, my worthy kinsman. I am your second cousin, Wilfred of Barnsdorf," cried the hunter, rising up and embracing my father. They filled their horn mugs to the brim and drank to one another after the German fashion. The conversation was then carried on in a low tone. All that we could collect from it was that our new relative and his daughter were to take up their abode in our cottage, at least for the present. In about an hour they both fell back in their chairs and appeared to sleep. "Marcella, did you hear?" said my brother in a low tone.
"Yes,"
replied Marcella in a whisper.
"I heard all. Oh, brother, I cannot bear to look upon that woman. I feel so frightened."
My brother made no reply, and shortly afterwards we were all three fast asleep. When we awoke the next morning, we found that the hunter's daughter had risen before us. I thought she looked more beautiful than ever. She came up to little Marcella and caressed her. The child burst into tears and sobbed as if her heart would break. But, not to detain you with too long a story, the huntsman and his daughter were accommodated in the cottage. My father and he went out hunting daily, leaving Christina with us. She performed all the household duties, was very kind to us children, and gradually the dislike of even little Marcella wore away. But a great change took place in my father. He appeared to have conquered his aversion to the sex and was most attentive to Christina. Often, after her father and we were in bed, he would sit up with her, conversing in a low tone by the fire. I ought to have mentioned that my father and the huntsman Wilfred slept in another portion of the cottage, and that the bed which he formerly occupied, and which was in the same room as ours, had been given up to the use of Christina. These visitors had been about 3 weeks at the cottage when, one night, after we children had been sent to bed, a consultation was held. My father had asked Christina in marriage, and had obtained both her own consent and that of Wilfred. After this, a conversation took place, which was, as nearly as I can recollect, as follows.
"You may take my child, Mynheer Krantz, and my blessing with her, and I shall then leave you and seek some other habitation. It matters little where."
"Why not remain here, Wilfred?"
"No, no. I am called elsewhere. Let that suffice, and ask no more questions. You have my child."
"I thank you for her, and will duly value her, But there is one difficulty.
I know what you would say.
There is no priest here in this wild country. True, neither is there any law to bind. Still, must some ceremony pass between you to satisfy a father? Will you consent to marry her after my fashion? If so, I will marry you directly."
"I will," replied my father.
"Then take her by the hand. Now, mynheer, swear."
"I swear," repeated my father,
"by all the spirits of the Hartz mountains."
"Nay, why not by heaven?" interrupted my father.
"Because it is not my humor," rejoined Wilfred. "If I prefer that oath, less binding perhaps than another, surely you will not thwart me." "Well, be it so then. Have your humor. Will you make me swear by that in which I do not believe?"
"Yet many do so, who in outward appearance are Christians," rejoined Wilfred. "Say, will you be married, or shall I take my daughter away with me?"
"Proceed," replied my father impatiently. "I swear by all the spirits of the Hartz mountains, by all their power for good or for evil, that I take Christina for my wedded wife, that I will ever protect her, cherish her, and love her, and that my hand will never be raised against her to harm her."
My father repeated the words after Wilfred.
"And if I fail in this my vow, may all the vengeance of the spirits fall upon me and upon my children. May they perish by the vulture, by the wolf, or other beasts of the forests. May their flesh be torn from their limbs, and their bones blanch in the wilderness. All this I swear."
My father hesitated as he repeated the last words. Little Marcella could not restrain herself, and as my father repeated the last sentence, she burst into tears. This sudden interruption appeared to discompose the party, particularly my father. He spoke harshly to the child, who controlled her sobs by burying her face under the bedclothes. Such was the second marriage of my father. The next morning the hunter Wilfred mounted his horse and rode away. My father resumed his bed, which was in the same room as ours, and things went on much as before the marriage, except that our new stepmother did not show any kindness toward us. Indeed, during my father's absence she would often beat us, particularly little Marcella, and her eyes would flash fire as she looked eagerly upon the fair and lovely child. One night my sister awoke me and my brother.
"What is the matter?"
said Caesar.
"She has gone out,"
whispered Marcella. "Gone out?"
"Yes, gone out at the door in her night clothes," replied the child. "I saw her get out of bed, look at my father to see if he slept, and then she went out at the door."
What could induce her to leave her bed, and all undressed, to go out in such bitter wintry weather with the snow deep on the ground, was to us incomprehensible. We lay awake, and in about an hour we heard the growl of a wolf close under the window.
"There is a wolf,"
said Caesar. "She will be torn to pieces."
"Oh no,"
cried Marcella. In a few minutes afterwards our stepmother appeared. She was in her nightdress, as Marcella had stated. She let down the latch of the door so as to make no noise, went to a pail of water, and washed her face and hands, and then slipped into the bed where my father lay. We all three trembled. We hardly knew why, but we resolved to watch the next night. We did so, and not only on the ensuing night, but on many others, and always at about the same hour, would our stepmother rise from her bed and leave the cottage. And after she was gone, we invariably heard the growl of a wolf under our window, and always saw her, on her return, wash herself before she retired to bed.
We observed also that she seldom sat down to meals, and that when she did, she appeared to eat with dislike. But when the meat was taken down to be prepared for dinner, she would often furtively put a raw piece into her mouth. My brother Caesar was a courageous boy. He did not like to speak to my father until he knew more. He resolved that he would follow her out and ascertain what she did. Marcella and I endeavored to dissuade him from this project, but he would not be controlled, and the very next night he lay down in his clothes, and as soon as our stepmother had left the cottage, he jumped up, took down my father's gun, and followed her. You may imagine in what a state of suspense Marcella and I remained during his absence. After a few minutes we heard the report of a gun. It did not awaken my father, and we lay trembling with anxiety. In a minute afterwards we saw our stepmother enter the cottage. Her dress was bloody. I put my hand to Marcella's mouth to prevent her crying out, although I myself was in great alarm. Our stepmother approached my father's bed, looked to see if he was asleep, and then went to the chimney and blew up the embers into a blaze. "Who is there?" said my father, waking up. "Lie still, dearest," replied my stepmother. "It is only me. I have lighted the fire to warm some water. I am not quite well." My father turned round and was soon asleep, but we watched our stepmother. She changed her linen and threw the garments she had worn into the fire, and we then perceived that her right leg was bleeding profusely as if from a gunshot wound. She bandaged it up, then dressing herself, remained before the fire until the break of day. Poor little Marcella, her heart beat quick as she pressed me to her side. So indeed did mine. Where was our brother, Caesar? How did my stepmother receive the wound unless from his gun? At last my father rose, and then for the first time I spoke, saying, "Father, where is my brother, Caesar?" "Your brother?" exclaimed he. "Why, where can he be?" "Merciful heaven! I thought as I lay very restless last night," observed our stepmother, "that I heard somebody open the latch of the door, and, dear me, husband, what has become of your gun?" My father cast his eyes up above the chimney and perceived that his gun was missing. For a moment he looked perplexed. Then, seizing a broad axe, he went out of the cottage without saying another word. He did not remain away from us long. In a few minutes he returned, bearing in his arms the mangled body of my poor brother. He laid it down and covered up his face. My stepmother rose up and looked at the body, while Marcella and I threw ourselves by its side, wailing and sobbing bitterly. "Go to bed again, children," said she sharply. "Husband," continued she, "your boy must have taken the gun down to shoot a wolf, and the animal has been too powerful for him. Poor boy, he has paid dearly for his rashness." My father made no reply. I wished to speak, to tell all, but Marcella, who perceived my intention, held me by the arm and looked at me so imploringly that I desisted. My father, therefore, was left in his error, but Marcella and I, although we could not comprehend it, were conscious that our stepmother was in some way connected with my brother's death. That day my father went out and dug a grave, and when he laid the body in the earth, he piled up stones over it so that the wolves should not be able to dig it up. The shock of this catastrophe was to my poor father very severe. For several days he never went to the chase, although at times he would utter bitter anathemas and vengeance against the wolves. But during this time of mourning on his part, my stepmother's nocturnal wanderings continued with the same regularity as before. At last my father took down his gun to repair to the forest, but he soon returned and appeared much annoyed. "Would you believe it, Christina, that the wolves, perdition to the whole race, have actually contrived to dig up the body of my poor boy, and now there is nothing left of him but his bones?" "Indeed," replied my stepmother. Marcella looked at me, and I saw in her intelligent eye all she would have uttered. "A wolf growls under our window every night, father," said I.
"Aye, indeed? Why did you not tell me, boy? Wake me the next time you hear it."
I saw my stepmother turn away. Her eyes flashed fire, and she gnashed her teeth. My father went out again, covering up with a larger pile of stones the little remnants of my poor brother which the wolves had spared. Such was the first act of the tragedy. The spring now came on. The snow disappeared, and we were permitted to leave the cottage, but never would I quit for one moment my dear little sister, to whom, since the death of my brother, I was more ardently attached than ever. Indeed, I was afraid to leave her alone with my stepmother, who appeared to have a particular pleasure in ill-treating the child. My father was now employed upon his little farm, and I was able to render him some assistance. Marcella used to sit by us while we were at work, leaving my stepmother alone in the cottage. I ought to observe that, as the spring advanced, so did my stepmother decrease her nocturnal rambles, and that we never heard the growl of the wolf under the window after I had spoken of it to my father. One day, when my father and I were in the field, Marcella being with us, my stepmother came out, saying that she was going into the forest to collect some herbs my father wanted, and that Marcella must go into the cottage and watch the dinner. Marcella went, and my stepmother soon disappeared in the forest, taking a direction quite contrary to that in which the cottage stood, and leaving my father and I, as it were, between her and Marcella. About an hour afterwards we were startled by shrieks from the cottage, evidently the shrieks of little Marcella. "Marcella has burnt herself, father," said I, throwing down my spade. My father threw down his, and we both hastened to the cottage. Before we could gain the door, out darted a large white wolf, which fled with the utmost celerity. My father had no weapon. He rushed into the cottage, and there saw poor little Marcella expiring. Her body was dreadfully mangled. The blood pouring from it had formed a large pool on the cottage floor. My father's first intention had been to seize his gun and pursue, but he was checked by this horrid spectacle. He knelt down by his dying child and burst into tears. Marcella could just look kindly on us for a few seconds, and then her eyes were closed in death. My father and I were still hanging over my poor sister's body when my stepmother came in. At the dreadful sight she expressed much concern, but she did not appear to recoil from the sight of blood, as most women do. "Poor child," said she. "It must have been that great white wolf which passed me just now and frightened me so. She's quite dead, Krantz." "I know it! I know it!" cried my father in agony. I thought my father would never recover from the effects of this second tragedy. He mourned bitterly over the body of his sweet child, and for several days would not consign it to its grave, although frequently requested by my stepmother to do so. At last he yielded, and dug a grave for her close by that of my poor brother, and took every precaution that the wolf should not violate her remains. I was now really miserable, as I lay alone in the bed which I had formerly shared with my brother and sister. I could not help thinking that my stepmother was implicated in both their deaths, although I could not account for the manner. But I no longer felt afraid of her. My little heart was full of hatred and revenge. The night after my sister had been buried, as I lay awake, I perceived my stepmother get up and go out of the cottage. I waited for some time, then dressed myself and looked out through the door, which I half opened. The moon shone bright, and I could see the spot where my brother and my sister had been buried. And what was my horror when I perceived my stepmother busily removing the stones from Marcella's grave. She was in her white night-dress, and the moon shone full upon her. She was digging with her hands and throwing away the stones behind her with all the ferocity of a wild beast. It was some time before I could collect my senses and decide what I should do. At last I perceived that she had arrived at the body and raised it up to the side of the grave. I could bear it no longer. I ran to my father and awoke him. "Father! Father!" cried I. "Dress yourself and get your gun!" "What?" cried my father. "The wolves are there, are they?" He jumped out of bed, threw on his clothes, and, in his anxiety, did not appear to perceive the absence of his wife. As soon as he was ready, I opened the door. He went out, and I followed him.
Imagine his horror when, unprepared as he was for such a sight, he beheld, as he advanced toward the grave, not a wolf, but his wife in her night-dress, on her hands and knees, crouching by the body of my sister, and tearing off large pieces of the flesh and devouring them with all the avidity of a wolf. She was too busy to be aware of our approach. My father dropped his gun. His hair stood on end. So did mine. He breathed heavily, and then his breath for a time stopped. I picked up the gun and put it into his hand. Suddenly he appeared as if concentrated rage had restored him to double vigor. He leveled his piece, fired, and with a loud shriek, down fell the wretch whom he had fostered in his bosom.
"God of heaven!" cried my father, sinking down upon the earth with a swoon as soon as he had discharged his gun. I remained some time by his side before he recovered. "Where am I?" said he. "What has happened? Oh, yes, I recollect now. Heaven forgive me!" He rose, and we walked up to the grave. What again was our astonishment and horror to find that instead of the dead body of my stepmother, as we expected, there was, lying over the remains of my poor sister, a large, white she-wolf. "The white wolf!" exclaimed my father. "The white wolf which decoyed me into the forest! I see it all now. I have dealt with the spirits of the Hartz mountains." For some time my father remained in silence and deep thought. He then carefully lifted up the body of my sister, replaced it in the grave, and covered it over as before, having struck the head of the dead animal with the heel of his boot, and, raving like a madman, he walked back to the cottage, shut the door, and threw himself on the bed. I did the same, for I was in a stupor of amazement. Early in the morning we were both roused by a loud knocking at the door, and in rushed the hunter Wilfred. "My daughter, man, my daughter! Where is my daughter?" cried he in a rage. "Where the wretch, the fiend, should be, I trust," replied my father, starting up and displaying equal choler. "Where she should be, in hell! Leave this cottage, or you may fare worse." "Ha, ha!" replied the hunter. "Would you harm a potent spirit of the Hartz mountains? Poor mortal, who must needs wed a werewolf. Out, demon! I defy thee in thy power. Yet shall you feel it. Remember your oath, your solemn oath, never to raise your hand against her to harm her." "I made no compact with evil spirits." "You did. And if you failed in your vow, you were to meet the vengeance of the spirits. Your children were to perish by the vulture, the wolf. Out, out, demon! And their bones blanch in the wilderness. Ha, 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 ha." My father, frantic with rage, seized his axe and raised it over Wilfred's head to strike. "All this I swear," continued the huntsman mockingly. The axe descended, but it passed through the form of the hunter, and my father lost his balance and fell heavily on the floor. "Mortal," said the hunter, striding over my father's body, "we have power over those only who have committed murder. You have been guilty of a double murder. You shall pay the penalty attached to your marriage vow. 2 of your children are gone, the 3rd is yet to follow, and follow them he will, for your oath is registered. Go. It were kindness to kill thee. Your punishment is that you live." The Shui-Mang plant is a poisonous herb. It is a creeper, like the bean, and has a similar red flower. Those who eat of it die and become Shui-Mang devils, tradition asserting that such devils are unable to be born again unless they can find someone else who has also eaten of this poison to take their place. These Shui-Mang devils abound in the province of Hunan, where, by the way, the phrase same-year man is applied to those born in the same year, instead of to people who graduated school at the same time. These same-year men exchange visits and call each other brother, their children addressing the father's brother as uncle. This has now become a regular custom there. A young man named Chu was on his way to visit a same-year friend of his when he was overtaken by a violent thirst. Suddenly he came upon an old woman sitting by the roadside under a shed and distributing tea gratis. Incidentally, this is by no means an uncommon form of charity. During the temporary distress at Canton in the summer of 1877, large tubs of gruel were to be seen standing at convenient points, ready for any poor person who might wish to stay his hunger. It is thus, and by similar acts of benevolence, such as building bridges, repairing roads, etc., that the wealthy Chinese person strives to maintain an advantageous balance in his record of good and evil. Chu immediately walked up to the old woman to get a drink. She invited him into the shed and presented him with a bowl of tea in a very cordial spirit, but the smell of it did not seem like the smell of ordinary tea, and he would not drink it, rising up to go away. The old woman stopped him and called out, "San Yang, bring out some good tea." Immediately a young girl came from behind the shed, carrying in her hands a pot of tea. She was about 14 or 15 years old, and of very fascinating appearance, with glittering rings and bracelets on her fingers and arms. As Chu received the cup from her, his reason fled, and, drinking down the tea she gave him, the flavor of which was unlike any other kind, he proceeded to ask for more. Then, watching for a moment when the old woman's back was turned, he seized her wrist and drew a ring from her finger. The girl blushed and smiled, and Chu, more and more inflamed, asked her where she lived. "Come again this evening," replied she, "and you'll find me here." Chu begged for a handful of her tea, which he stowed away with the ring, and took his leave. Arriving at his destination, he felt a pain in his heart, which he at once attributed to the tea, telling his friend what had occurred. "Alas, you are undone!" cried the other. "They were Shui-Mang devils. My father died in the same way, and we were unable to save him. There is no help for you." Chu was terribly frightened, and produced the handful of tea, which his friend at once pronounced to be the leaves of the Shui-Mang plant. He then showed him the ring, and told him what the girl had said, whereupon his friend, after some reflection, said, "She must be San Yang, of the Cow family." "How could you know her name?" asked Chu, hearing his friend use the same words as the old woman. "Oh," replied he, "there was a nice-looking girl of that name who died some years ago from eating of the same herb. She is doubtless the girl you saw." Here someone observed that if the person so entrapped by a devil only knew its name and could procure an old pair of its shoes, he might save himself by boiling them in water and drinking the liquor as medicine. Chu's friend thereupon rushed off at once to the Cow family and implored them to give him an old pair of their daughter's shoes, but they, not wishing to prevent their daughter from finding a substitute in Chu, flatly refused his request. So he went back in anger and told Chu, who ground his teeth with rage, saying, "If I die, she shall not obtain her transmigration thereby." His friend then sent him home, and just as he reached the door he fell down dead. Chu's mother wept bitterly over his corpse, which was in due course interred, and he left behind one little boy, barely a year old. His wife did not remain a widow, but in 6 months married again and went away, putting Chu's son under the care of his grandmother, who was quite unequal to any toil and did nothing but weep morning and night. One day she was carrying her grandson about in her arms, crying bitterly all the time, when suddenly in walked Chu. His mother, much alarmed, brushed away her tears and asked him what it meant. "Mother," replied he, "down in the realms below I heard you weeping. I am therefore come to tend you. Although a departed spirit, I have a wife who is likewise come to share your toil, therefore do not grieve." His mother inquired who his wife was, to which he replied, When the Cow family sat still and left me to my fate, I was greatly incensed against them, and after my death I sought after San Niang, not knowing where she was. I have recently seen my old same-year friend, and he told me where she was. She had come to life again in the person of the baby daughter of a high official named Jen, but I went thither and dragged her spirit back. She is now my wife, and we get on extremely well together." A very pretty and well-dressed young lady here entered and made obeisance to Chu's mother, Chu saying, "This is San Yang of the Cow family." Although not a living being, Mrs. Chu at once took a great fancy to her. Chu sent her off to help in the work of the house, and, in spite of not being accustomed to this sort of thing, she was so obedient to her mother-in-law as to excite the compassion of all. The two then took up their quarters in Chu's old apartments, and there they continued to remain. Meanwhile, San Niang asked Chu's mother to let the Cow family know, and this she did, notwithstanding some objections raised by her son. Mr. and Mrs. Cow were much astonished at the news, and, ordering their carriage, proceeded at once to Chu's house. There they found their daughter, and parents and child fell into each other's arms. San Niang entreated them to dry their tears, but her mother, noticing the poverty of Chu's household, was unable to restrain her feelings. "We are already spirits," cried San Niang. "What matters poverty to us? Besides, I am very well treated here, and am altogether as happy as I can be." They then asked her who the old woman was, to which she replied, "Her name was Ni. She was mortified at being too ugly to entrap people herself, and got me to assist her. She has now been born again at a soy shop in the city." Then, looking at her husband, she added, "Come, since you are the son-in-law, pay the proper respect to my father and mother, or what shall I think of you?" Chu made his obeisance, and San Niang went into the kitchen to get food ready for them, at which her mother became very melancholy and went away home, whence she sent a couple of maid-servants, 100 ounces of silver, and rolls of cloth and silk, besides making occasional presents of food and wine, so that Chu's mother lived in comparative comfort. San Niang also went from time to time to see her parents, but would never stay very long, pleading that she was wanted at home and such excuses. And if the old people attempted to keep her, she simply went off by herself. Her father built a nice house for Chu with all kinds of luxuries in it, but Chu never once entered his father-in-law's door. Subsequently, a man of the village who had eaten Shui-Mang and had died in consequence came back to life, to the great astonishment of everybody. However, Chu explained it, saying, "I brought him back to life. He was the victim of a man named Li Chiu, but I drove off Li's spirit when it came to make the other take his place." Chu's mother then asked her son why he did not get a substitute for himself, to which he replied, "I do not like to do this. I am anxious to put an end to, rather than take advantage of, such a system. Besides, I am very happy waiting on you, and have no wish to be born again." From that time, all persons who had poisoned themselves with Shui-Mang were in the habit of feasting Chu and obtaining his assistance in their trouble. But in 10 years' time his mother died, and he and his wife gave themselves up to sorrow, and would see no one, bidding their little boy put on mourning, beat his breast, and perform the proper ceremonies. 2 years after Chu had buried his mother, his son married the granddaughter of a high official named Jen. This gentleman had had a daughter by a concubine who had died when only a few months old, and now, hearing the strange story of Chen's wife, he came to call on her and arrange the marriage. He then gave his granddaughter to Chu's son, and a free intercourse was maintained between the two families. However, one day Chu said to his son, "Because I have been of service to my generation, God has appointed me keeper of the dragons, and I am now about to proceed to my post." Thereupon 4 horses appeared in the courtyard, drawing a carriage with yellow hangings, the flanks of the horses being covered with scale-like trappings. Husband and wife came forth in full dress and took their seats, and, while son and daughter-in-law were weeping their adieus, disappeared from view. That very day the Cow family saw their daughter arrive, and, bidding them farewell, she told them the same story. The old people would have kept her, but she said, "My husband is already on his way," and, leaving the house, parted from them forever. Chu's son was named Nyo, and his literary name was Li Chen. He begged San Niang's bones from the Cow family and buried them by the side of his father's.
It was intolerably unchanged, the dim, dark-toned room. In an agony of recognition, my glance ran from one to another of the comfortable, familiar things that my earthly life had been passed among. Incredibly distant from it all as I essentially was, I noted sharply that the very gaps that I myself had left in my bookshelves still stood unfilled, that the delicate fingers of the ferns that I had tended were still stretched futilely toward the light, that the soft, agreeable chuckle of my own little clock, like some elderly woman with whom conversation has become automatic, was undiminished, unchanged. Or so it seemed at first. But there were certain trivial distances that shortly smote me. The windows were closed too tightly, for I had always kept the house very cool, although I had known that Teresa preferred warm rooms. And my work basket was in disorder. It was preposterous that so small a thing should hurt me so. Then, for this was my first experience of the shadow-folded transition, the odd alteration of my emotions bewildered me. For at one moment the place seemed so humanly familiar, so distinctly my own proper envelope, that for love of it I could have laid my cheek against the wall, while in the next I was miserably conscious of strange new shrillnesses. How could they be endured, and had I ever endured them, those harsh influences that I now perceived at the window? Light and color so blinding that they obscured the form of the wind, tumult so discordant that one could scarcely hear the roses open in the garden below. But Teresa didn't seem to mind any of these things. Disorder, it is true, the dear child had never minded. She was sitting all this time at my desk. At my desk. Occupied, I could only too easily surmise how. In the light of my own habits of precision, it was plain that somber correspondence should have been attended to before, but I believe that I did not really reproach Teresa, for I knew that her notes, when she did write them, were perhaps less perfunctory than mine. She finished the last one as I watched her, and added it to the heap of black-bordered envelopes that lay on the desk. Poor girl. I saw now that they had cost her tears. Yet, living beside her, day after day, year after year, I had never discovered what deep tenderness my sister possessed. Toward each other it had been our habit to display only a temperate affection, and I remember having always thought it distinctly fortunate for Teresa, since she was denied my happiness, that she could live so easily and so pleasantly without emotions of the devastating sort. And now, for the first time, I was really to behold her. Could it be Teresa, after all, this tangle of subdued turbulences? Let no one suppose that it is an easy thing to bear, the relentlessly lucid understanding that I then first exercised, or that, in its first enfranchisement, the timid vision does not yearn for its old screens and mists. Suddenly, as Teresa sat there, her head, filled with its tender thoughts of me, held in her gentle hands, I felt Alan's step on the carpeted stair outside. Teresa felt it too, but how? For it was not audible. She gave a start, swept the black envelopes out of sight, and pretended to be writing in a little book. Then I forgot to watch her any longer, in my absorption in Alan's coming. It was he, of course, that I was awaiting. It was for him that I had made this first lonely, frightened effort to return, to recover. It was not that I had supposed he would allow himself to recognize my presence, for I had long been sufficiently familiar with his hard and fast denials of the invisible. He was so reasonable always, so sane, so blindfolded.
But I had hoped that because of his very rejection of the ether that now contained me, I could perhaps all the more safely, all the more secretly, watch him, linger near him. He was near now, very near. But why did Teresa, sitting there in the room that had never belonged to her, appropriate for herself this coming? It was so manifestly I who had drawn him, I whom he had come to seek. The door was ajar. He knocked softly at it. "Are you there, Teresa?" he called. He expected to find her then, there in my room? I shrank back, fearing almost to stay. "I shall have finished in a moment," Teresa told him, and he sat down to wait for her. No spirit still unreleased can understand the pang that I felt with Alan sitting almost within my touch. Almost irresistibly, the wish beset me to let him for an instant feel my nearness. Then I checked myself, remembering, absurd, piteous human fears, that my too unguarded closeness might alarm him. It was not so remote a time that I myself had known them, those blind, uncouth timidities. I came, therefore, somewhat nearer, but I did not touch him. I merely leaned toward him and with incredible softness whispered his name. That much I could not have forborne. The spell of life was still too strong in me. But it gave him no comfort, no delight. "Teresa," he called, in a voice dreadful with alarm, and in that instant the last veil fell, and desperately, scarce believingly, I beheld how it stood between them, those two. She turned to him that gentle look of hers. "Forgive me," came from him hoarsely, "but I had suddenly the most unaccountable sensation. Can there be too many windows open? There's such a chill about." "There are no windows open," Teresa assured him. "I took care to shut out the chill. You are not well, Alan." "Perhaps not," he embraced the suggestion. "And yet I feel no illness apart from this abominable sensation that persists. And Teresa, you must tell me, do I fancy it, or do you, too, feel something strange here?" "Oh, there is something very strange here," she half sobbed. "There always will be." "Good heavens, child, I didn't mean that." He rose and stood looking about him. "I know, of course, that you have your beliefs, and I respect them, but you know equally well that I have nothing of the sort, so don't let's conjure up anything inexplicable." I stayed impalpably, imponderably near him. Wretched and bereft though I was, I could not have left him while he stood denying me. "What I mean," he went on in his low, distinct voice, "is a special, an almost ominous sense of cold. Upon my soul, Teresa," he paused, "if I were superstitious, if I were a woman, I should probably imagine it to seem a presence." He spoke that last word very faintly, but Teresa shrank from it nevertheless. "Don't say that, Alan," she cried out. "Don't think it, I beg of you. I tried so hard myself not to think it, and you must help me. You know it is only perturbed, uneasy spirits that wander. With her it is quite different. She's always been so happy. She must still be." I listened, stunned, to Teresa's sweet dogmatism. From what blind distances came her confident misapprehensions. How dense, both for her and for Alan, was the separating vapor. Alan frowned. "Don't take me literally, Teresa," he explained, and I, who a moment before had almost touched him, now held myself aloof and heard him with a strange, untried pity new born in me. "I'm not speaking of what you call spirits. It's something much more terrible." He allowed his head to sink heavily on his chest. "If I did not positively know that I had never done her any harm, I should suppose myself to be suffering from guilt, from remorse. Teresa, you know better than I, perhaps. Was she content always? Did she believe in me?"
believe in you when she knew you to be so good, when you adored her? She thought that? She said it? Then what in heaven's name ails me? Unless it is all as you believe, Teresa, and she knows now what she didn't know then, poor dear, and Mine's what? What do you mean, Alan? I, who with my perhaps illegitimate advantage saw so clear, knew that he had not meant to tell her. I did him that justice, even in my first jealousy. If I had not tortured him so by clinging near him, he would not have told her. But the moment came and overflowed, and he did tell her. Passionate, tumultuous story that it was. During all our life together, Alan's and mine, he had spared me, had kept me wrapped in the white cloak of an unblemished loyalty. But it would have been kinder, I now bitterly thought, if, like many husbands, he had years ago found for the story he now poured forth some clandestine listener. I should not have known. But he was faithful and good, and so he waited until I, mute and chained, was there to hear him. So well did I know him, as I thought. So thoroughly had he once been mine that I saw it in his eyes, heard it in his voice before the words came. And yet, when it came, it lashed me with the whips of an unbearable humiliation, for I, his wife, had not known how greatly he could love. And that Teresa, soft little traitor, should, in her still way, have cared too. Where was the iron in her, I moaned with my stricken spirit? Where the steadfastness? From the moment he bade her, she turned her soft little petals up to him, and my last delusion was spent. It was intolerable, and none the less so that in another moment she had, prompted by some belated thought of me, renounced him. Alan was hers, yet she put him from her, and it was my part to watch them both. Then, in the anguish of it all, I remembered, awkward, untutored spirit that I was, that I now had the great recourse. Whatever human things were unbearable, I had no need to bear. I ceased, therefore, to make the effort that kept me with them. The pitiless poignancy was dulled, the sounds and the light ceased, the lovers faded from me, and again I was mercifully drawn into the dim, infinite spaces. There followed a period whose length I cannot measure, and during which I was able to make no progress in the difficult, dizzying experience of release. Earth-bound, my jealousy relentlessly kept me. Though my two dear ones had forsworn each other, I could not trust to them, for theirs seemed to me an affection of a more than mortal magnanimity. Without a ghostly sentinel to prick them with sharp fears and recollections, who could believe that they would keep to it? Of the efficacy of my own vigilance, so long as I might choose to exercise it, I could have no doubt, for I had by this time come to have a dreadful exultation in the new power that lived in me. Repeated delicate experiment had taught me how a touch or a breath, a wish or a whisper could control Alan's acts, could keep him from Teresa. I could manifest myself as palely, as transiently as a thought. I could produce the merest necessary flicker, like the shadow of a just opened leaf on his trembling, tortured consciousness, and these unrealized perceptions of me he interpreted, as I had known that he would, as his soul's inevitable penance. He had come to believe that he had done evil in silently loving Teresa all these years, and it was my vengeance to allow him to believe this, to prod him ever to believe it afresh. I am conscious that this frame of mind was not continuous in me, for I remember, too, that when Alan and Teresa were safely apart and sufficiently miserable, I loved them as dearly as I ever had, more dearly, perhaps, for it was impossible that I should not perceive in my new emancipation that they were, each of them, something more and greater than the two beings I had once ignorantly pictured them. For years they had practiced a selflessness of which I could once scarcely have conceived, and which even now I could only admire without entering into its mystery. While I had lived solely for myself, these two divine creatures had lived exquisitely for me. They had granted me everything, themselves nothing,
For my undeserving sake, their lives had been a constant torment of renunciation, a torment they had not sought to alleviate by the exchange of a single glance of understanding. There were even marvelous moments when, from the depths of my newly informed heart, I pitied them, poor creatures, who, withheld from the infinite solaces that I had come to know, were still utterly within that shell of sense, so frail, so piteously contrived for pain. Within it, yes, yet exercising qualities that so sublimely transcended it. Yet the shy, hesitating compassion that had thus had birth in me was far from being able to defeat the earlier, earthlier emotion. The two, I recognized, were in a sort of conflict, and I, regarding it, assumed that the conflict would never end, that for years, as Alan and Teresa reckoned time, I should be obliged to withhold myself from the great spaces and linger, suffering, grudging, shamed, where they lingered. It can never have been explained, I suppose, what, to devitalized perception such as mine, the contact of mortal beings with each other appears to be. Once to have exercised this sense-freed perception is to realize that the gift of prophecy, although the subject of such frequent marvel, is no longer mysterious. The merest glance of our sensitive and uncloyed vision can detect the strength of the relation between two beings, and therefore instantly calculate its duration. If you see a heavy weight suspended from a slender string, you can know, without any wizardry, that in a few moments the string will snap. Well, such, if you admit the analogy, is prophecy, is foreknowledge. And it was thus that I saw with Teresa and Alan. For it was perfectly visible to me that they would very little longer have the strength to preserve, near each other, the denuded impersonal relation that they, and that I, behind them, insisted on, and that they would have to separate. It was my sister, perhaps the more sensitive, who first realized this. It had now become possible for me to observe them almost constantly. The effort necessary to visit them had so greatly diminished, so that I watched her, poor, anguished girl, prepare to leave him. I saw each reluctant movement that she made. I saw her eyes worn from self-searching. I heard her step grown timid from inexplicable fears. I entered her very heart and heard its pitiful wild beating. And still I did not interfere. For at this time I had a wonderful, almost demoniacal sense of disposing matters to suit my own selfish will. At any moment I could have checked their miseries, could have restored happiness and peace, and yet it gave me, and I could weep to admit it, a monstrous joy to know that Teresa thought she was leaving Alan of her own free intention, when it was I who was contriving, arranging, insisting. And yet she wretchedly felt my presence near her, I am certain of that. A few days before the time of her intended departure, my sister told Alan that she must speak with him after dinner. Our beautiful old house branched out from a circular hall with great arched doors at either end, and it was through the rear doorway that always in summer, after dinner, we passed out into the garden adjoining. As usual, therefore, when the hour came, Teresa led the way. That dreadful daytime brilliance that in my present state I found so hard to endure was now becoming softer. A delicate, capricious twilight breeze danced inconsequently through the languidly whispering leaves. Lovely pale flowers blossomed like little moons in the dusk, and over them the breath of mignonette hung heavily. It was a perfect place, and it had so long been ours, Alan's and mine. It made me restless and a little wicked that these two should be there together now. For a little they walked about together, speaking of common, daily things. Then suddenly Teresa burst out, "I am going away, Alan. I have stayed to do everything that needed to be done. Now your mother will be here to care for you, and it is time for me to go." He stared at her and stood still. Teresa had been there so long, she so definitely, to his mind, belonged there. And she was, as I also had jealously known, so lovely there, the small, dark, dainty creature in the old hall, on the wide staircases, in the garden. Life there without Teresa, even the intentionally remote, the perpetually renounced Teresa, he had not dreamed of it. He could not, so suddenly, conceive of it. "Sit here," he said, and drew her down beside him on a bench, "and tell me what it means, why you are going. Is it because of something that I have done?" She hesitated. I wondered if she would dare tell him. She looked out and away from him, and he waited long for her to speak. The pale stars were sliding into their places. The whispering of the leaves was almost hushed. All about them it was still and shadowy and sweet. It was that wonderful moment when, for lack of a visible horizon, the not yet darkened world seems infinitely greater, a moment when anything can happen, anything be believed in. To me, watching, listening, hovering, there came a dreadful purpose and a dreadful courage. Suppose for one moment Teresa should not only feel, but see me. Would she dare to tell him then? There came a brief space of terrible effort. All my fluttering, uncertain forces strained to the utmost. The instant of my struggle was endlessly long, and the transition seemed to take place outside me, as one sitting on a train, motionless, sees the leagues of earth float by, and then, in a bright, terrible flash, I knew I had achieved it. I had attained visibility. Shuddering, insubstantial, but luminously apparent, I stood there before them, and for the instant that I maintained the visible state, I looked straight into Teresa's soul. She gave a cry, and then, thing of silly, cruel impulses that I was, I saw what I had done. The very thing that I wished to avert I had precipitated, for Alan, in his sudden terror and pity, had bent and caught her in his arms. For the first time they were together, and it was I who had brought them. Then, to his whispered urging to tell the reason of her cry, Teresa said, "Frances was here. You didn't see her standing there under the lilacs with no smile on her face?" my dear," was all that Alan said. I had so long now lived invisibly with them, he knew that she was right. "I suppose you know what it means?" she asked him calmly. "Dear Teresa," said Alan slowly, if you and I should go away somewhere, could we not evade all this ghostliness? And will you come with me?" "Distance would not banish her," my sister confidently asserted. And then she said softly, "Have you thought what a lonely, awesome thing it must be to be so newly dead? Pity her, Alan. We who are warm and alive should pity her. She loves you still. That is the meaning of it all, you know. And she wants us to understand that for that reason we must keep apart. Oh, it was so plain in her white face as she stood there, and you did not see her?" "It was your face that I saw," Alan solemnly told her. Oh, how different he had grown from the Alan that I had known. "And yours is the only face that I shall ever see." And again he drew her to him. She sprang from him. "You are defying her, Alan," she cried, "and you must not. It is her right to keep us apart if she wishes. It must be as she insists. I shall go, as I told you. And, Alan, I beg of you, leave me the courage to do as she demands." They stood facing each other in the deep dusk, and the wounds that I had dealt them gaped red and accusing. "We must pity her," Teresa had said. And as I remembered that extraordinary speech, and saw the agony in her face, and the greater agony in Alan's, there came the great irreparable cleavage between mortality and me. In a swift, merciful flame, the last of my mortal emotions, gross and tenacious they must have been, was consumed. My cold grasp of Alan loosened, and a new unearthly love of him blossomed in my heart. I was now, however, in a difficulty with which my experience in the newer state was scarcely sufficient to deal. How could I make it plain to Alan and Teresa that I wished to bring them together, to heal the wounds that I had made? Pityingly, remorsefully, I lingered near them all that night and the next day, and by that time had brought myself to the point of a great determination. In the little time that was left before Teresa should be gone and Alan bereft and desolate, I saw the one way that lay open to me to convince them of my acquiescence in their destiny. In the deepest darkness and silence of the night, I made a greater effort than it will ever be necessary for me to make again. When they think of me, Alan and Teresa, I pray now that they will recall what I did that night, and that my 1,000 frustrations and selfishnesses may shrivel and be blown from their indulgent memories. Yet the following morning, as she had planned, Teresa appeared at breakfast dressed for her journey. Above in her room were the sounds of departure. They spoke little during the brief meal, but when it was ended, Alan said, "Teresa, there's a half an hour before you go. Will you come upstairs with me? I had a dream that I must tell you of."
"Alan."
She looked at him, frightened, but went with him.
"It was of Francis you dreamed,"
she said quietly as they entered the library together. Did I say it was a dream? But I was awake, thoroughly awake. I had not been sleeping well, and I heard twice the striking of the clock. And as I lay there, looking out at the stars and thinking of you, Teresa, she came to me, stood there before me, in my room. It was no sheeted spectre, you understand. It was Frances, literally she. In some inexplicable fashion, I seemed to be aware that she wanted to make me know something, and I waited, watching her face. After a few moments it came. She didn't speak precisely. That is, I'm sure I heard no sound, and yet the words that came from her were definite enough. She said, "Don't let Teresa leave you. Take her and keep her." Then she went away. Was that a dream?
"I had not meant to tell you," Teresa eagerly answered, "but now I must. It is too wonderful. What time did your clock strike, Alan?"
1 the last time.
"Yes, it was then that I awoke, and she had been with me. I had not seen her, but her arm had been about me, and her kiss was on my cheek. Oh, I know, it was unmistakable, and the sound of her voice was with me."
Then she bade you too?
"Yes, to stay with you. I am glad we told each other."
She smiled tearfully and began to fasten her wrap. "But you are not going now," Alan cried. "You know that you cannot, now that she has asked you to stay." "Then you believe, as I do, that it was she?" Teresa demanded. "I can never understand, but I know," he answered her. "And now you will not go?"
"I am freed. There will be no further semblance of me in my old home, no sound of my voice, no dimmest echo of my earthly self. They have no further need of me, the two that I have brought together. Theirs is the fullest joy that the dwellers in the shell of sense can know. Mine is the transcendent joy of the unseen spaces."
In Cornwall's fair land, by the pool on the moor, Tregeagle the wicked did dwell. Who has not heard of the wild spirit Tregeagle? He haunts equally the moor, the rocky coasts, and the blown sandhills of Cornwall. From north to south, from east to west, this doomed spirit is heard of, and to the day of judgment he is doomed to wander, pursued by avenging fiends, forever endeavoring to perform some task by which he hopes to secure repose, and being forever defeated. Who has not heard the howling of Tregeagle? When the storms come with all their strength from the Atlantic and urge themselves upon the rocks around the Land's End, the howls of the spirit are louder than the roaring of the winds. When calms rest upon the ocean and the waves can scarcely form upon the resting waters, low wailings creep along the coast. These are the wailings of this wandering soul. When midnight is on the moor or on the mountains, and the night winds whistle amidst the rugged cairns, the shrieks of Tregeagle are distinctly heard. We know, then, that he is pursued by the demon dogs, and that till daybreak he must fly with all speed before them. The voice of Tregeagle is everywhere, and yet he is unseen by human eye.
Every reader will at once perceive that Tregeagle belongs to the mythologies of the oldest nations, and that the traditions of this wandering spirit in Cornwall, which centre upon one tyrannical magistrate, are but the appropriation of stories which belong to every age and every country. Tradition thus tells Tregeagle's tale. There are some men who appear to be from their births given over to the will of tormenting demons. Such a man was Tregeagle. He is as old as the hills, yet there are many circumstances in the story of his life which appear to remove him from this remote antiquity. Modern legends assert him to belong to comparatively modern times, and say that, without doubt, he was one of the Tregeagles who once owned a Trevorder near Bodmin. We have not, however, much occasion to trouble ourselves with the man or his life. It is with the death and the subsequent existence of a myth that we are concerned. Certain it is that the man Tregeagle was diabolically wicked. He seems to have been urged on from one crime to another until the cup of sin was overflowing. Tregeagle was wealthy beyond most men of his time, and his wealth purchased for him that immunity which the Church, in her degenerate days, too often accorded to those who could aid, with their gold or power, the sensual priesthood. As a magistrate, he was tyrannical and unjust, and many an innocent man was wantonly sacrificed by him for the purpose of hiding his own dark deeds. As a landlord, he was rapacious and unscrupulous, and frequently so involved his tenants in his toils that they could not escape his grasp. The stain of secret murder clings to his memory, and he is said to have sacrificed a sister whose goodness stood between him and his demon passions. His wife and children perished victims to his cruelties. At length death drew near to relieve the land of a monster whose name was a terror to all who heard it. Devils waited to secure the soul they had won, and Tregeagle, in terror, gave to the priesthood wealth that they might fight with them and save his soul from eternal fire. Desperate was the struggle, but the powerful exorcisms of the bandit brotherhood of a neighboring monastery drove back the evil ones, and Tregeagle slept with his fathers, safe in the custody of the churchmen who buried him with high honours in St. Breoch Church. They sang chants and read prayers above his grave to secure the soul which they thought they had saved. But Tregeagle was not fated to rest. Satan desired still to gain possession of such a gigantic sinner, and we can only refer what ensued to the influence of the wicked spiritings of his ministers. A dispute arose between two wealthy families respecting the ownership of extensive lands around Bodmin. The question had been rendered more difficult by the nefarious conduct of Tregeagle, who had acted as a steward to one of the claimants, and who had destroyed ancient deeds, forged others, and indeed made it appear that he was the real proprietor of the domain. Large portions of the land Tregeagle had sold, and other parts were leased upon long terms, he having received all the money and appropriated it. His death led to inquiries, and then the transactions were gradually brought to light. Involving, as this did, large sums of money, and indeed it was a question upon which turned the future well-doing or ruin of a family, it was fought by the lawyers with great pertinacity. The legal questions had been argued several times before the judges at the assizes. The trials had been deferred, new trials had been sought for and granted, and every possible plan known to the lawyers for postponing the settlement of a suit had been tried. A day was at length fixed, upon which a final decision must be come to, and a special jury was sworn to administer justice between the contending parties. Witnesses innumerable were examined as to the validity of a certain deed, and the balance of evidence was equally suspended. The judge was about to sum up the case and refer the question to the jury when the defendant in the case, coming into court, proclaimed aloud that he had yet another witness to produce. There was a strange silence in the judgment hall. It was felt that something chilling to the soul was amongst them, and there was a simultaneous throb of terror as Tregeagle was led into the witness box. When the awestruck assembly had recovered, the lawyers for the defendant commenced their examination, which was long and terrible. The result, however, was the disclosure of an involved system of fraud, of which the honest defendant had been the victim, and the jury unhesitatingly gave a verdict in his favor. The trial over, everyone expected to see the spectre witness removed. There, however, he stood, powerless to fly, although he evidently desired to do so. Spirits of darkness were waiting to bear him away, but some spell of holiness prevented them from touching him. There was a struggle with the good and the evil angels for this sinner's soul, and the assembled court appeared frozen with horror. At length, the judge with dignity commanded the defendant to remove his witness. "To bring him from the grave has been to me so dreadful a task that I leave him to your care and that of the priors by whom he was so beloved." Having said this, the defendant left the court. The churchmen were called in, and long were the deliberations between them and the lawyers as to the best mode of disposing of Tregeagle. They could resign him to the devil at once, but by long trial the worst of his crimes might be absolved, and as good churchmen they could not sacrifice a human soul. The only thing was to give the spirit some task, difficult beyond the power of human nature, which might be extended far into eternity. Time might thus gradually soften the obdurate soul which still retained all the black dyes of the sins done in the flesh, that by infinitely slow degrees repentance might exert its softening power. The spell therefore put upon Tregeagle was, that as long as he was employed on some endless assigned task, there should be hope of salvation, and that he should be secure from the assaults of the devil as long as he labored steadily. A moment's rest was fatal. Labor unresting, and forever was his doom. One of the lawyers, remembering that Dawsberry Pool was bottomless, and that a thorn bush which had been flung into it but a few weeks before had made its appearance in Falmouth Harbour, proposed that Tregeagle might be employed to empty this profound lake. Then one of the churchmen, to make the task yet more enduring, proposed that it should be performed by the aid of a limpet shell, having a hole in it. This was agreed to, and the required incantations were duly made. Bound by mystical spells, Tregeagle was removed to the dark moors and duly set to work. Year after year passed by, and there, day and night, summer and winter, storm and shine, Tregeagle was bending over the dark water, working hard with his perforated shell, yet the pool remained at the same level. His old enemy the devil kept a careful eye on the doomed one, resolving, if possible, to secure so choice an example of evil. Often did he raise tempests sufficiently wild, as he supposed, to drive Tregeagle from his work, knowing that if he failed for a season to labor, he could seize and secure him. These were long tried in vain, but at length an auspicious hour presented itself. Nature was at war with herself. The elements had lost their balance, and there was a terrific struggle to recover it. Lightnings flashed and coiled like fiery snakes around the rocks of Rockter. Fireballs fell on the desert moors and hissed in the accursed lake. Thunders pealed through the heavens and echoed from hill to hill. An earthquake shook the solid earth, and terror was on all living. The winds arose and raged with a fury which was irresistible, and hail beat so mercilessly on all things that it spread death around. Long did Tregeagle stand the pelting of the pitiless storm, but at length he yielded to its force and fled. The demons in crowds were at his heels. He doubled, however, on his pursuers and returned to the lake, but so rapid were they that he could not rest the required moment to dip his shell in the now seething waters. 3 times he fled round the lake, and the evil ones pursued him. Then, feeling that there was no safety for him near Dawsberry Pool, he sprang swifter than the wind across it, shrieking with agony, and thus, since the devils cannot cross water, and were obliged to go round the lake, he gained on them and fled over the moor. Away, away went Tregeagle, faster and faster the dark spirits pursuing, and they had nearly overtaken him when he saw Roach Rock and its chapel before him.
He rushed up the rocks with giant power, clambered to the eastern window, and dashed his head through it, thus securing the shelter of its sanctity. The defeated demons retired, and long and loud were their wild wailings in the air. The inhabitants of the moors and of the neighboring towns slept not a wink that night. Tregeagle was safe. His head was within the holy church, though his body was exposed on a bare rock to the storm. Earnest were the prayers of the blessed hermit in his cell on the rock to be relieved from his nocturnal and sinful visitor. In vain were the recluse's prayers. Day after day, as he knelt at the altar, the ghastly head of the doomed sinner grinned horridly down at him. Every holy ejaculation fell upon Tregeagle's ear like molten iron. He writhed and shrieked under the torture, but legions of devils filled the air, ready to seize him if for a moment he withdrew his head from the sanctuary. Sabbath after Sabbath, the little chapel on the rock was rendered a scene of sad confusion by the interruptions which Tregeagle caused. Men trembled with fear at his agonizing cries, and women swooned. At length the place was deserted, and even the saint of the rock was wasting to death by the constant perturbation in which he was kept by the unholy spirit, and the demons who, like carrion birds, swarmed around the holy cairn. Things could not go on thus. The monks of Bodmin and the priests from the neighboring churches gathered together, and the result of their long and anxious deliberations was that Tregeagle, guarded by 2 saints, should be taken to the north coast near Padstow and employed in making trusses of sand and ropes of sand with which to bind them. By powerful spell, Tregeagle was removed from Roach and fixed upon the sandy shores of the Padstow district. Sinners are seldom permitted to enjoy any peace of soul. As the ball of sand grew into form, the tides rose, and the breaker spread out the sands again a level sheet. Again was it packed together and again washed away. Toil, 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 day and night unrestingly, sand on sand grew with each hour, and ruthlessly the ball was swept by one blow of a sea wave along the shore. The cries of Tregeagle were dreadful, and as the destruction of the sand heap was constantly recurring, a constantly increasing despair gained the mastery over hope, and the ravings of the baffled soul were louder than the roarings of the winter tempest. Baffled in making trusses of sand, Tregeagle seized upon the loose particles and began to spin them into a rope. Long and patiently did he pursue his task, and hope once more rose like a star out of the midnight darkness of despair. A rope was forming when a storm came up with all its fury from the Atlantic and swept the particles of sand away over the hills. The inhabitants of Padstow had seldom any rest. At every tide the bowlings of Tregeagle banished sleep from each eye. But now so fearful were the sounds of the doomed soul in the madness of the struggle between hope and despair that the people fled the town and clustered upon the neighboring plains, praying as with one voice to be relieved from the sad presence of this monster. St. Petroc, moved by the tears and petitions of the people, resolved to remove the spirit, and, by the intense earnestness of his prayers, after long wrestling, he subdued Tregeagle to his will. Having chained him with the bonds which the saints had forged with his own hands, every link of which had been welded with a prayer, St. Petroc led the spirit away from the north coast and stealthily placed him on the southern shores. In those days Ella's town, now Helston, was a flourishing port. Ships sailed into the estuary up into the town, and they brought all sorts of merchandise and returned with cargoes of tin from the mines of Breage and Wendron. The wily monk placed his charge at Barepa, and there condemned him to carry sacks of sand across the estuary of the Loo and to empty them at Porthleven until the beach was clean down to the rocks. The priest was a good observer. He knew that the sweep of the tide was from Trewavis Head round the coast toward the Lizard, and that the sand would be carried back steadily and speedily, as fast as the spirit could remove it. Long did Tregeagle labor, and, of course, in vain. His struggles were giant-like to perform his task, but he saw the sands return as regularly as he removed them. The sufferings of the poor fishermen who inhabited the coast around Porthleven were great.
As the howlings of Tregeagle disturbed the dwellers in Padstow, so did they now distress these toil-worn men. When sorrow is highest, relief is nighest, and a mischievous demon-watcher in pure wantonness brought that relief to those fishers of the sea. Tregeagle was laden with a sack of sand of enormous size and was wading across the mouth of the estuary when one of those wicked devils who were kept ever near Tregeagle in very idleness tripped up the heavily laden spirit. The sea was raging with the irritation of a passing storm, and, as Tregeagle fell, the sack was seized by the waves and its content poured out across this arm of the sea. There, to this day, it rests, a bar of sand, fatally destroying the harbor of Ellistown. The rage of the inhabitants of this seaport, now destroyed, was great, and with all their priests away they went to the Loo bar and assailed their destroyer. Against human anger, Tregeagle was proof. The shock of tongues fell harmlessly on his ear, and the assault of human weapons was unavailing. By the aid of the priests and faith-inspired prayers, the bonds were once more placed upon Tregeagle, and he was, by the force of bell, book, and candle, sent to the land's end. There he would find no harbor to destroy, and but few people to terrify. His task was to sweep the sands from Porthcurnow Cove round the headland called Toy Peden Penwith into Nongesal Cove. Those who know that rugged headland, with its cubical masses of granite, piled in titanic grandeur one upon another, will appreciate the task, and, when to all the difficulties are added the strong sweep of the Atlantic current, that portion of the Gulf Stream which washes our southern shores, it will be evident that the melancholy spirit has, indeed, a task which must endure until the world shall end. Even until today is Tregeagle laboring at his task. In calms his wailing is heard, and those sounds which some call the sighing of the wind are known to be the moanings of Tregeagle, while the coming storms are predicated by the fearful roarings of this condemned mortal. John Tregeagle the Steward. There are numerous versions of this legend, and sundry statements made as to the man who is supposed to have achieved the no very envious immortality which he enjoys. One or two of these may interest the reader. The following very characteristic narrative from a much-esteemed correspondent gives several incidents which have not a place in the legend as I have related it, which comprehends the explanation given for the appearance of Tregeagle at so many different parts of the county. The Tregeagle, of whom mention occurs in the writings of Cornish legendary authors, was a real person, a member of a respectable family, resident during the 17th century at Trevorder in the parish of St. Breoch, and identical probably with a John Tregeagle, whose tombstone may yet be seen in the parish church there, close to the chancel. Lingering one day amid the venerable arches of that same church, the narrator, a native of the parish, encountered, near a small transept called the Trevorder Aisle, the sexton, a man then perhaps about 80 years of age. The conversation turning not unnaturally on the illustrious dead, the narrator was gratified in receiving from the lips of the old man the following characteristic specimen of folklore, the greater part of which has remained clearly imprinted on his memory after a lapse of many years, though he thinks he has had to supply the very last sentence of all from the general popular tradition, and here and there he may have had to supply a few expressions. This John Tregeagle, I've heard one tell, sir, he was a steward to a lord. And a man came for to the court and paid his rent, and John Tregeagle didn't put no cross as to his name in the books. And after that Tregeagle died, and the lord came down to look after his rents, and when he seed the books he seed this man's name that there wasn't no cross to it. And he sent for the man, and he asked for his rent, and the man said he'd paid his rent, and the lord said he hadn't, there weren't no cross as to his name in the books, and he told him that he'd have the law for him if he didn't pay. And the man, he didn't know what to do. He went for to the minister of Simonward, and the minister asked if he'd a got faith, and the man, he hadn't got faith, and he was obliged for to go homewards again. And after that the 'sizes were coming nigh, and he was becoming afeard pure enough, and he went for to the minister again, and told him he'd got faith, and the minister might do whatever he liked.
And the minister dragged a ring out on the floor, and he called out 3 times, "John Tregeagle, John Tregeagle, John Tregeagle." And I've heard the old men tell it, sir. This John Tregeagle stood before him in the middle of the ring. And he went forward under the assizes, and gave us evidence and told how this man had paid his rent, and the Lord he was cast. And after that he was come back to their own house, and these John Tregeagle gave him on a brave deal of trouble. He was knocking about the place and wouldn't leave man alone at all. And they went forward to the minister and asked he for to lay in. And the minister said Dicky was there lick out. They're rotten up, and they was getting him down again the best way they could. And I've heard the old men tell it, sir. The minister, he got £300 for the laying of him again. And first he was bound to the old Eppinstock up to Churchtown. Fin after that he was bound to the old oven in Treverder, and James White down to Wadebridge. He was there when they did open it. And after that he was bound to Dosmary Pool, and they do say that there he is now, emptying of it out with a limpet shell, with a hole in the bottom of it.
Once, when Muso Kokushi, a priest of the Zen sect, was journeying alone through the province of Mino, he lost his way in a mountain district where there was nobody to direct him. For a long time he wandered about helplessly, and he was beginning to despair of finding shelter for the night when he perceived, on the top of a hill lighted by the last rays of the sun, one of those little hermitages called anjitsu, which are built for solitary priests. It seemed to be in a ruinous condition, but he hastened to it eagerly, and found that it was inhabited by an aged priest from whom he begged the favor of a night's lodging. This the old man harshly refused, but he directed Muso to a certain hamlet in the valley adjoining where lodging and food could be obtained. Muso found his way to the hamlet, which consisted of less than a dozen farm cottages, and he was kindly received at the dwelling of the headman. 40 or 50 persons were assembled in the principal apartment at the moment of Muso's arrival, but he was shown into a small separate room where he was promptly supplied with food and bedding. Being very tired, he lay down to rest at an early hour, but a little before midnight he was roused from sleep by a sound of loud weeping in the next apartment. Presently the sliding screens were gently pushed apart, and a young man, carrying a lighted lantern, entered the room, respectfully saluted him, and said, "Reverend sir, it is my painful duty to tell you that I am now the responsible head of this house. Yesterday I was only the oldest son, but when you came here, tired as you were, we did not wish that you should feel embarrassed in any way. Therefore, we did not tell you that father had died only a few hours before. The people whom you saw in the next room are the inhabitants of this village. They all assembled here to pay their last respects to the dead, and now they are all going to another village about 3 miles off, for, by our custom, no one of us may remain in this village during the night after a death has taken place. We make the proper offerings and prayers. Then we go away, leaving the corpse alone. Strange things always happen in the house where a corpse has thus been left, so we think that it will be better for you to come away with us. We can find you good lodging in the other village. But perhaps, as you are a priest, you have no fear of demons or evil spirits, and if you are not afraid of being left alone with the body, you will be very welcome to the use of this poor house. However, I must tell you that nobody except a priest would dare to remain here tonight." Muso made answer, "For your kind intentions and your generous hospitality I am deeply grateful. But I am sorry that you did not tell me of your father's death when I came, for, though I was a little tired, I certainly was not so tired that I should have found any difficulty in doing my duty as a priest. Had you told me, I could have performed the service before your departure. As it is, I shall perform the service after you have gone away, and I shall stay by the body until morning. I do not know what you mean by your words about the danger of staying here alone, but I am not afraid of ghosts or demons. Therefore, Please to feel no anxiety on my account." The young man appeared to be rejoiced by these assurances and expressed his gratitude in fitting words. Then the other members of the family and the folk assembled in the adjoining room, having been told of the priest's kind promises, came to thank him, after which the master of the house said, "Now, reverend sir, much as we regret to leave you alone, we must bid you farewell. By the rule of our village, none of us can stay here after midnight. We beg, kind sir, that you will take every care of your honorable body while we are unable to attend upon you. And if you happen to hear or see anything strange during our absence, please tell us of the matter when we return in the morning." All then left the house except the priest, who went to the room where the dead body was lying. The usual offerings had been set before the corpse, and a small Buddhist lamp, a tomio, was burning. The priest recited the service and performed the funeral ceremonies, after which he entered into meditation. So, meditating, he remained through several silent hours, and there was no sound in the deserted village. But when the hush of night was at its deepest, there noiselessly entered a shape, vague and vast, and in the same moment Musso found himself without power to move or speak. He saw that shape lift the corpse as with hands and devour it more quickly than a cat devours a rat, beginning at the head and eating everything, the hair and the bones and even the shroud. And the monstrous thing, having thus consumed the body, turned to the offerings and ate them also. Then it went away as mysteriously as it had come. When the villagers returned next morning, they found the priest awaiting them at the door of the headman's dwelling. All in turn saluted him, and when they had entered and looked about the room, no one expressed any surprise at the disappearance of the dead body and the offerings. But the master of the house said to Musso, "Reverend sir, you have probably seen unpleasant things during the night. All of us were anxious about you. But now we are very happy to find you alive and unharmed. Gladly we would have stayed with you if it had been possible, but the law of our village, as I told you last evening, obliges us to quit our houses after a death has taken place and to leave the corpse alone. Whenever this law has been broken heretofore, some great misfortune has followed. Whenever it is obeyed, we find that the corpse and the offerings disappear during our absence. Perhaps you have seen the cause." Then Musso told of the dim and awful shape that had entered the death chamber to devour the body and the offerings. No person seemed to be surprised by his narration, and the master of the house observed, "What you have told us, reverend sir, agrees with what has been said about this matter from ancient time." Musso then inquired, "Does not the priest on the hill sometimes perform the funeral service for your dead?" "What priest?" the young man asked. "The priest who yesterday evening directed me to this village," answered Musso. "I called at his enjitsu on the hill yonder. He refused me lodging, but told me the way here." The listeners looked at each other as in astonishment, and, after a moment of silence, the master of the house said, "Reverend sir, there is no priest and there is no enjitsu on the hill. For the time of many generations there has not been any resident priest in this neighborhood." Musso said nothing more on the subject, for it was evident that his kind hosts supposed him to have been deluded by some goblin. But, after having bidden them farewell and obtained all necessary information as to his road, he determined to look again for the hermitage on the hill, and so to ascertain whether he had really been deceived. He found the enjitsu without any difficulty, and this time its aged occupant invited him to enter. When he had done so, the hermit humbly bowed down before him, exclaiming, "Ah, I am ashamed! I am ashamed! I am very much ashamed. I am exceedingly ashamed." "You need not be ashamed for having refused me shelter," said Musso. You directed me to the village yonder, where I was very kindly treated, and I thank you for that favor." "I can give no man shelter," the recluse made answer, "and it is not for the refusal that I am ashamed. I am ashamed only that you should have seen me in my real shape, for it was I who devoured the corpse and the offerings last night before your eyes. Know, reverend sir, that I am a Jikininki, I, an eater of human flesh. Have pity upon me, and suffer me to confess the secret fault by which I became reduced to this condition. A long, long time ago, I was a priest in this desolate region. There was no other priest for many leagues around, so, in that time, the bodies of the mountain folk who died used to be brought here, sometimes from great distances, in order that I might repeat over them the holy service. But I repeated the service and performed the rites only as a matter of business. I thought only of the food and the clothes that my sacred profession enabled me to gain, and because of this selfish impiety I was reborn immediately after my death into the state of a Jikininki. Since then I have been obliged to feed upon the corpses of the people who die in this district. Every one of them I must devour in the way that you saw last night. Now, reverend sir, let me beseech you to perform a Segake service for me. Help me by your prayers, I entreat you, so that I may be soon able to escape from this horrible state of existence." No sooner had the hermit uttered this petition than he disappeared, and the hermitage also disappeared at the same instant. And Muso Kogushi found himself kneeling alone on the high grass beside an ancient and moss-grown tomb in the form of a 5-circle monument, which seemed to be the tomb of a priest.